Welcome to Luke's Stories, where camping isn't all about campfires and stars, but also nightmares in the dark. This happened in September, just as summer was bowing out, and the air carried that crisp edge of fall. My name is Elliot Harper, and I'm 28 years old. I've always considered myself a practical guy, not prone to flights of fancy or jumping at shadows. But what happened to me and Julian Torres in the depths of Chippewa National Forest isn't something I can explain logically. It's haunted my nights ever since. It all started when Julian convinced me to join him on a weekend camping trip. Julian, my best friend since college, was struggling with his photography career, and I was fresh out of a painful breakup. He thought this trip could help us both clear our heads. I was hesitant. I prefer familiar trails and well-marked campgrounds, but Julian, ever the impulsive adventurer, insisted we try somewhere more remote. That's how we ended up driving north to Cast Lake in Chippewa National Forest. Julian promised it would be serene, untouched, and photogenic. The phrase sounded like an ad pitch, but I agreed. We packed light, sleeping bags, a tent, a portable stove, and Julian's camera gear. The drive to the forest was pleasant enough. By the time we arrived, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense pine trees. Julian was practically vibrating with excitement as he fiddled with his GPS. "We'll head down this path," he said, pointing to a faint trail barely visible under fallen leaves. "That's not on the map," I said, frowning. "Exactly," he grinned. "The best spots never are." Against my better judgment, I followed him. The trail quickly became more of a suggestion than a path. We pushed through thick underbrush, each step crunching on twigs and leaves. Julian snapped photos of everything, beams of sunlight slicing through the trees, a squirrel leaping between branches, even a twisted old tree with bark resembling a screaming face. "This is what I needed," Julian said, his voice breathless. By dusk we found a small clearing and set up camp. The forest was alive with sound, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and the rustle of small animals in the brush. It was comforting in a way. After eating a quick meal of instant noodles, we settled by the fire. "I told you this was a good idea," Julian said, poking at the flames with a stick. I shrugged. "We'll see." That night I woke to silence. It was the kind of quiet that presses on your ears, so unnatural it forces you awake. The forest had gone dead. No crickets, no wind. Just nothing. I sat up, straining to listen. That's when I noticed the footprints in the dim light of the dying fire. I saw them circling our tent, large, distorted tracks, like a human's, but with toes too long and claws at the tips. They weren't ours, and they definitely weren't made by any animal I could think of. "Julian," I hissed, shaking his shoulder. "Huh?" he mumbled. "Footprints," I whispered. "Look." He groaned, but sat up, rubbing his eyes. When he saw the tracks, his face lost its usual bravado. "Could be a bear," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Since when do bears have toes like that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his camera and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the clearing for a brief moment, and I could have sworn I saw movement at the edge of the trees, a shadow, low to the ground, slipping out of sight. The next day, Julian tried to laugh it off. "Probably just a deer," he said, scrolling through the photos. The tracks were blurry in the picture, but the unease from the night before clung to me like a second skin. We packed up and decided to move farther into the forest, hoping to shake the eerie feeling. Julian wanted to find a ridge he'd read about online, something with a view of the lake. His GPS, an old model with a cracked screen, kept losing signal, but he assured me he could navigate by instinct. "Instincts are why we got lost in Colorado that one time," I reminded him. "That was different," he said, grinning. It wasn't different. By mid-afternoon, we were hopelessly off course. The forest around us grew denser, the trees older and gnarled. Julian's humor started to fade, replaced by irritation. We set up camp again in a clearing, this one darker and less inviting than the first. That night, the cries started. We were sitting by the fire, Julian fiddling with his camera, when we heard it, a faint, high-pitched wail, like a woman calling for help. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "Yeah," he stood, peering into the darkness. "It's probably a coyote," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. Coyotes don't sound like that. The cry came again, closer this time. "Help me," the voice was frail, almost broken. Against every instinct screaming in my head, Julian grabbed his flashlight and started toward the sound. "What are you doing?" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Someone might be hurt," he said, shaking me off. "No, something's not right." Before we could argue further, the voice called again, this time from behind us. "Help me." We froze. Slowly, we turned. The voice had changed. It sounded like me. "Julian," it said. "Help me." Panic bubbled in my chest. Julian's flashlight beam swept across the trees, but there was nothing there. No one, just the trees and the dark. Did you hear that?" Julian whispered. "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling. Suddenly the fire flickered and dimmed. A branch snapped nearby, loud enough to make us both jump. Then we saw it, a shadow slipping between the trees. It was too fast, too fluid, and too human-shaped to be an animal. We backed toward the fire. "Stay close," I said, gripping the hatchet I'd brought for chopping firewood. The shadow stopped just beyond the firelight. In the faint glow of the flames, I saw it for the first time. A gaunt figure, pale and impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its hollow eyes glinted with a sickly yellow light, and its mouth, if you could call it that, twisted into a grotesque mockery of a grin. We didn't sleep that night. Julian sat clutching his camera, muttering about getting a picture of the thing. I kept the hatchet close, my eyes never leaving the edge of the clearing. The creature didn't move closer, but it didn't leave either. At dawn we packed up and tried to find our way back to the main trail. Julian's GPS was useless, and my phone had no signal. The creature followed us, just out of sight. Occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of it through the trees or hear its mimicry, the sound of Julian's voice calling my name or mine calling his. By afternoon, Julian was unraveling. "This is incredible," he said, his eyes wide with manic energy. "No one's ever gotten proof of these things. If I could just—" "Stop," I snapped. "This isn't a game. That thing isn't some photo op. It's hunting us." Julian glared at me but didn't argue. We stumbled into a clearing littered with animal carcasses, deer, rabbits, even a black bear, all torn apart. Their bodies were arranged in a grotesque pattern. Symbols were carved into the surrounding trees, markings I didn't recognize. "Eli," Julian's voice was barely a whisper. The air felt wrong here, heavy and oppressive. The creature emerged from the shadows, stepping into the clearing for the first time. It was worse up close. Its flesh hung loosely from its bones, and its movements were jerky like a puppet on strings. Julian raised his camera, but I knocked it from his hand. "Run," I said. We bolted, crashing through the forest like wild animals. The creature gave chase, its inhuman shrieks echoing around us. "This way!" Julian shouted, veering left. We burst into another clearing, this one with a pile of dried branches in the center. Desperation overtook me. I grabbed Julian's lighter and set the branches ablaze. The fire roared to life, and the creature stopped short, hissing and retreating into the shadows. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then I realized the fire had spread to the underbrush. "Eli, we have to go!" Julian yelled. We ran again, the flames chasing us as the forest turned into an inferno. Smoke filled the air, choking my lungs. We finally stumbled onto a dirt road, collapsing in exhaustion as the fire raged behind us. A passing ranger found us and called for help. We never told anyone about the creature. Who would believe us? Julian tried to share the photos he took, but they were dismissed as hoaxes or glitches. Even now I hear its voice sometimes, faint and distant, calling my name. "Help me!" My name is Henry Thompson. I'm 48 years old, and last spring I set out on an RV road trip across the Midwest. After my divorce and losing my job, I felt like I needed to get away, from the noise of the city and, frankly, from myself. I wanted solitude, time to think, and maybe a little peace. What I found at Pikes Peak State Park in Iowa was something else entirely, something I can't explain even now. It started like any other stop on my trip. I pulled my beat-up RV into the small campground on a misty April morning. The park was quiet, with only a few other campers scattered around, their tents barely visible through the fog rolling off the Mississippi River. It was perfect. Isolated, but not desolate. After parking near a trail that led to the bluff, I stepped out to take in the view. The cliffs loomed high above the water, the kind of place that felt timeless, ancient. The fog clung to the edges, blurring the line between land and sky. It was beautiful, sure, but there was something else about it. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a few trails, snapped some photos of the river, and scribbled a few half-hearted journal entries in the evening. Writing had always been my outlet, even back when I was a journalist. Now, it was more of a lifeline, something to keep me grounded when the weight of my regrets threatened to crush me. That night, I cooked dinner over a camp stove and settled in to read. The fog was thicker than before, swirling outside the RV windows like smoke. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Around midnight, I heard something. At first I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was a voice, faint and indistinct, carried on the breeze. "Jack," it whispered. I bolted upright. It was distant, almost too faint to hear, but unmistakable. My name. Jack. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. The fog swallowed the beam of light almost immediately, reducing visibility to a few feet. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Jack." I backed toward the RV, my heart pounding. The voice didn't sound threatening, but it didn't sound right either. It had a hollow, echoing quality, like it was coming from a broken radio. I shut the door and locked it, refusing to go back outside. The next morning I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming, or maybe the stress of the last few months was finally catching up with me. I forced myself to focus on the day's plans. More hiking, more writing, anything to distract me. As I walked along one of the trails near the bluff, I came across another camper. She was sitting on a fallen log, staring out at the river. "Morning," I said, giving her a nod. She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't go near the bluff after dark," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a strange intensity in her eyes. I frowned. "Why is that?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "People say it's haunted." "Haunted?" I couldn't help but chuckle. She didn't smile. "There's something out there, something old. It doesn't like to be disturbed." I thought about the voice I'd heard the night before, but didn't say anything. Instead, I just nodded and kept walking, brushing her off as a superstitious local. That night, the voice returned. I was sitting at the small table in the RV, writing in my journal, when I heard it again. "Jack." It was louder this time, clearer. My pen slipped from my hand, leaving a jagged line across the page. "Jack, come outside." My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't just calling my name. It was inviting me. Against my better judgment, I stepped to the window and peered out. The fog was even thicker than the night before, and I could barely make out the shapes of the trees. But then, in the distance, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the bluff. It was tall and shadowy, its outline blurry in the mist. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Come outside," the voice repeated, louder now. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping onto the damp ground. My hands trembled as I pointed the beam of light toward the bluff, but the figure was gone. The whispers continued, growing fainter, as if retreating into the woods. The next morning I found my journal pages filled with words I didn't remember writing. "This is your fault. You can't run. He's waiting." The words were scrawled in my handwriting, but I had no memory of writing them. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. That afternoon I ran into the camper again, the woman who had warned me about the bluff. "Something's out there," I said, my voice low. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "It always finds the broken ones," she said. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she turned and walked away before I could. That night, I couldn't stay in the RV. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the bluff, determined to prove to myself that there was nothing out there. The fog wrapped around me as I approached the edge, the sound of the river below muffled and distant. I stopped when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the bluff, his back to me. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. "Jack," he said, his voice smooth and deep. I froze. The figure turned, and I saw his face, or rather, the lack of it. His features were indistinct, like a smear on a canvas, but his eyes glowed faintly red. "I know what you want," he said. "I can give it to you." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "All your pain, all your guilt, it can be gone. You just have to say yes." He extended a hand, long and pale, his fingers unnaturally thin. I took a step back, shaking my head. The devil smiled. "Think about it, Jack. No more regret, no more loneliness, no more failure." Images flashed through my mind. My ex-wife's angry face, the newsroom where I'd been fired, the empty apartment I'd left behind. "No," I whispered. His smile faded. "Are you sure?" I turned and ran. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. The whispers followed me the whole way, louder and more insistent, but I didn't look back. By the time I reached the RV, the fog had begun to lift, and the forest was eerily quiet. I left the park at dawn, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing at the edge of the bluff, watching me go. And I swear he was smiling. In 1991, I left behind the chaos of city life and settled in a remote cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. My name is Tom Trey, and I'll be the first to admit that moving off the grid was as much about escaping people as it was about the appeal of nature. People are messy, complicated. Trees, rivers, not so much. It's not that I don't like people, I just like them better when they're far away. My cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a single room with a wood stove, a hammock I strung up in the corner, and a basic kitchen I built myself. The nearest town was almost 2 hours away, and I was perfectly fine with that. I had a dog named Murphy for company, and between the two of us, we were pretty content with our little bubble of wilderness isolation. That morning, I had decided to head further into the forest than usual, maybe explore some parts I hadn't yet. I'd been feeling restless lately, the kind of itch you get when the quiet becomes a little too loud, you know? I figured a long hike would do the trick. I packed up my rifle, never left home without it, and headed off with Murphy trailing at my heels. Murphy wasn't a big dog, some kind of mutt with a mix of husky and who knows what else, but he was a good boy. Always stuck close, rarely barked unless there was a reason. We set off into the trees, the air thick with that damp, that earthy smell that only deep woods have. The deeper we went, the quieter it got, until even the birds seemed to vanish from the soundscape. If I hadn't known better, I would have thought we were walking through an abandoned forest. About 2 hours in, Murphy stopped dead, ears up, nose twitching. I stopped too. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, scanning the trees around us. It wasn't unusual for him to react to a deer or some other critter, but the way he stood tense and still told me something was off. I gripped my rifle tighter. Whatever it wasn't anything familiar. Murphy let out a low whine and took a few steps backward. That's when I heard it, a sharp snap, like a branch breaking, but louder, more deliberate, the kind of sound that isn't an accident. I whipped around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the trees seemed to close in around me, the dense brush making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. "Hello?" I called out. I don't know why. It's not like I expected an answer, but something in my gut told me I wasn't alone anymore. Another snap, this time closer, and I saw movement, something big, just beyond the trees. My first thought was a bear, but it moved too quickly, too fluidly for that. Whatever it wasn't an animal I recognized. My heart started to race, and Murphy growled, a low, deep sound I'd never heard him make before. Without thinking, I raised the rifle and aimed it in the direction of the noise. "Show yourself!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response, just the eerie silence that seemed to swallow up everything else. Then I saw it. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, it was real, all right. About 7 feet tall, covered in patchy, mangy fur like it had been rolling in mud for days. Its legs were long and spindly, almost like a deer's, but the torso was hunched and muscular, more like a primate. The face, if you could call it that, was somewhere between a wolf and a human. The mouth too wide, filled with sharp teeth that seemed more suited for tearing flesh than anything else. I know it sounds crazy, but there it was, standing not 30 feet from me, staring me down with an intent I couldn't place. My hands were shaking, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if my rifle would do any good. It was like looking at something out of a nightmare. Murphy growled again, louder this time, and the thing took a step forward. It didn't run, didn't charge, just a single calculated step. I didn't need any more encouragement. I squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the trees, and the creature let out a sound that I can only describe as a howl of pain and fury. It staggered back, but it didn't go down. Blood, thick and dark, oozed from the wound in its chest, but it didn't seem to slow the thing down. If anything, it just pissed it off. I fired again. This time it let out a snarl, a sound so guttural that it vibrated in my chest. Murphy barked and lunged at it, but I grabbed his collar, pulling him back before he could get too close. The thing wasn't running, but it wasn't retreating either. It just stood there, watching, as if deciding whether to finish me off. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and bolted into the trees, moving faster than anything that size had any right to. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed Murphy, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and ran. By the time we made it back to the cabin, I was gasping for air, heart pounding out of my chest. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, even though I knew a wooden door wasn't going to stop something like that if it wanted to get in. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the silence outside, waiting, but nothing came. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning, I decided I needed to do something about it. Heading into town to tell the sheriff wasn't an option. I wasn't about to be labeled the crazy guy who sees monsters in the woods, but I couldn't just stay there waiting for it to come back. I packed up my truck, loaded Murphy in, and headed out. I figured I could lay low in town for a few days, maybe get some perspective on what had happened. As I was pulling out of the driveway, I saw something lying at the edge of the trees, something that hadn't been there the day before. It was a body. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out, heart racing as I approached. It was a man, or what was left of him. His torso had been torn open, ribcage exposed, guts spilled out onto the forest floor. His face was mangled, unrecognizable, but the worst part was the claw marks. Deep gouges raked across his chest and arms like he'd been attacked by something with hands, not paws. Hands. Murphy barked, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the corpse. I knew what had done it. I knew what had been lurking out there, and I knew that it wasn't gone. I called the sheriff anonymously, telling them there was a body by the road. Then I left town, far away from the Bitterroot Mountains, far away from whatever was out there. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it had seen me, and I had a feeling it wasn't the kind of creature that let people walk away. My name's Kay Reiner, and I've been a cop in Ravenshaw, Wyoming for the better part of, well, I'm not counting anymore. Small town, small problems, right? Mostly traffic stops, the occasional domestic dispute, and once in a while a bar brawl that leaves the place smelling like old whiskey and bad decisions. Nothing I can't handle. People around here know me as the guy who can crack a joke, diffuse a situation, and still make it to Sunday dinner with my folks. But last Tuesday? That was different. It was 2012, the kind of quiet day where I was mostly concerned with who's parking their truck too close to the fire hydrant, or who's double-dipping on permits for the fall hunting season. I'd just gotten back from grabbing coffee at Merle's Diner, the only spot in town with passable coffee, when dispatch called in a missing persons report. A family of tourists hadn't checked out of their rented cabin by the lake. The owner, an old guy named Earl Patterson, had tried to get in touch with them after they were 2 hours late. No answer. Most times, it's a mix-up. People think checkout is at noon when it's actually 10 a.m. But Earl was jittery on the phone. I could hear him breathing heavy. Earl's usually laid back, grumbles a lot but never nervous. I figured I'd take a drive up there to see what was going on. Ravenshaw's got a lake, sure, but we're not exactly a tourist trap. Anyone from out of town stands out. The cabin itself is about 15 miles into the woods, isolated and quiet. It's the kind of place people rent when they want to forget the world exists for a weekend. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find something no one was going to believe. The drive up was uneventful. The sky had this overcast thing going on, and the wind was whipping through the trees, giving the woods an eerie vibe. I wasn't thinking much of it, just another day in a small-town cop's life, I figured. When I pulled up to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door was ajar, not wide open, but not locked either. I stepped out of my cruiser, hand on my belt, and made my way to the porch. "Anyone home?" I called, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. It smelled wrong, like the place hadn't been aired out in weeks. There was something else, too. Something that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't place it right away. The cabin was empty. No bags. No sign of life. I made my way through the kitchen and glanced at the half-eaten sandwiches on the table. Looked like someone had been in the middle of lunch when they decided to drop everything and walk out. Not normal, but not enough to start sounding alarms. And then I saw it. In the living room, there was a trail of mud, if it was mud, leading to the back door. I followed it, noticing how the prints seemed too large, too irregular. They didn't look like boots or bare feet. No, it was something else entirely. Something animal, maybe. Out back, the forest seemed darker than it should be for midday. Dense, looming trees stretched toward the sky, casting long shadows over the ground. I followed the prints. They led into the woods. After about 50 yards, I found something I wasn't expecting. Blood. A lot of it, splattered across the pine needles, smeared across the rocks, but no bodies. "Jesus," I muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. My stomach churned, but I kept it together. Whatever had happened here, it was bad, real bad. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling sound from deeper in the woods. Not quite a growl, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't armed with anything more than my service pistol, and let's just say I wasn't feeling confident that 6 rounds were going to cut it. Still, I pressed on. Maybe it was stupid. Maybe I should have called for backup. But out here, backup was at least 30 minutes away, and I wasn't about to let whatever was out there get too far ahead. The deeper I went into the woods, the stranger things got. Broken branches, tufts of fur snagged on bark, more of that reddish-brown smear leading me forward. I wasn't an expert tracker by any means, but this was all wrong. Nothing about this trail made sense. It was erratic, zigzagging, doubling back on itself, like whatever left it was either playing with its prey or wasn't thinking like a normal predator. That's when I found the first body, or what was left of it. The torso was mangled beyond recognition, clothes shredded, the limbs missing. Whoever it had been, they weren't just dead, they'd been torn apart. And whatever did it hadn't bothered with eating the body. It was just destruction, pure, brutal destruction. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. There was a rustling in the trees behind me, a movement that didn't match the wind. I turned, slow, my heart thudding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That's when I saw it. Just for a split second, something huge hunched over, crouching low to the ground, covered in matted fur. Its limbs were long and wrong. Too many joints, too many angles. It vanished into the underbrush before I could even blink. I froze, gun drawn but useless. My mind raced. What the hell was I dealing with? A bear? No, bears don't tear people apart like that. Wolves, maybe? But wolves don't leave half-eaten bodies in the open. This was something else entirely, something worse. I decided then that it was time to go. Whatever had killed that family was still out here, and I wasn't equipped to deal with it. But as I turned to head back toward the cabin, I heard a snap, a twig breaking underfoot. I wasn't alone. I barely had time to react. The thing lunged out from behind a tree, fast, faster than anything that size had a right to be. I fired off 2 shots, more out of reflex than anything else. One hit it, but it didn't stop. I felt a sharp pain in my side as I was knocked to the ground, my gun flying from my hand. This thing was on top of me, snarling, its hot breath against my neck. I could feel its claws digging into my side, tearing at my uniform. I kicked, punched, did anything I could to get it off me, but it was like fighting a force of nature. Then, just as quickly as it had attacked, it was gone, disappearing back into the woods as if it had never been there. I lay there, gasping for air, my side bleeding, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? I don't remember how I got back to my cruiser. Adrenaline, probably, maybe shock. By the time I made it back to town, I was pale, bleeding, and shaking like a leaf in the wind. I told the chief everything, well, most of it. You can't just walk in and say a damn monster tried to rip you in half. But I showed him the blood, the wounds, and I told him about the family. We went back up there, of course. Me, the chief, and 2 deputies. The bodies were still there, so was the blood. But that thing, it was gone. Vanished into the woods like a ghost. We searched for hours, called in wildlife experts. Hell, even the feds showed up. But they didn't find anything. The official report said it was a bear attack. You and I both know that's bull. Now, I'm not saying I know what I saw because I don't. But whatever it was, it's still out there, somewhere in the woods. My name is Jessica Campbell and I'm 31 years old. This happened in late October last year during a camping trip I should have said no to. Looking back now, I wish I had trusted my instincts. But when your boyfriend insists, and his plan includes his best friend and an RV, you shrug and say, sure, why not? What could possibly go wrong? We were heading to the Glade Top Trail in Mark Twain National Forest, Missouri. It was one of those scenic, out-of-the-way places Travis found online while scouring for hidden gems. He was always chasing after some unspoiled piece of wilderness he could claim he'd conquered. He thought this trip would be perfect, a 4-day getaway with me, his best friend Eli, and Eli's sister, Hannah. I liked camping, but not like this. Not with Travis's demanding itineraries where relaxing meant hiking until your legs felt like jelly and eating instant noodles by firelight. Eli was just as much of a wild card. He was funny, sure, but in that irresponsible, forget-everything-important kind of way. And Hannah? Sweet girl, but quiet. She mostly stayed behind her camera, snapping pictures of sunsets and deer. The first day went smoothly enough. We parked the RV in a clearing off the trail, surrounded by trees turning gold and orange in the autumn chill. Travis was in his element, barking orders and setting up camp. Eli fumbled through his backpack, realizing he'd forgotten fuel for the portable stove. Guess it's campfire cooking then, he joked, earning a glare from Travis. Relax, man. It's just food. Hannah wandered off to take photos while Travis grumbled about having to adjust the meal plan. I tried to smooth things over, but I could feel the tension already brewing. That night, the forest came alive with strange sounds. The crackle of our fire barely masked the occasional rustling in the bushes or the distant hoots of owls. At one point we heard whistling, high and sharp, like someone calling for a dog. We all froze. Probably the wind, Travis said, poking the fire. Eli smirked. Or a ghost. Isn't this place supposed to be haunted? Stop it, I snapped, but even I couldn't shake the chill that ran down my spine. The second day started with an ambitious hike. Travis insisted we take a trail that wasn't marked on the map, claiming it would lead to a hidden overlook. The trail was narrow and rocky, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in on us the further we went. Hannah stopped often to take pictures, capturing the way the light filtered through the leaves. She lingered behind, so I stayed with her while Travis and Eli forged ahead. I didn't mind the slower pace. Something about the forest felt off. The trees were too still, the silence too heavy. No birds chirped, no squirrels darted across the path, just the crunch of our boots and the occasional click of Hannah's camera. By the time we caught up with the others, they were standing at the edge of a clearing, staring at something. A deer stood frozen in the middle of the trail, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't move, even when we got closer. "That's weird," Hannah murmured, snapping a photo. "We should keep going," Travis said, his voice tight. The deer watched us as we passed, its dark eyes following our every step. That night the unease deepened. While sitting around the campfire, a stranger appeared on the trail. He was an older man wearing a tattered coat and carrying a walking stick. He stopped just at the edge of the firelight, his face shadowed. "Evening," he said, his voice raspy. "You folks camping out here?" Travis nodded. "Yeah, why?" The man smiled faintly. Just be careful. Some places in these woods don't take kindly to visitors. Before any of us could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. Eli laughed nervously. Well, that wasn't creepy at all. Travis brushed it off, but Hannah and I exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the man's words lingered in my mind. The third night was the worst. It started with voices, soft and indistinct, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I woke up in the RV, thinking it was one of the guys. But when I looked out the window, I saw a figure standing by the dying campfire. "Travis," I whispered, but he was asleep beside me. The figure turned its head toward the RV, and in the dim light I thought I saw Eli's face, but something was wrong. The way he moved, jerky and unnatural, made my skin crawl. I shook Travis awake. "There's someone out there." He groaned and got up, peering out the window. By then, the figure was gone. "You're imagining things," he said, climbing back into bed. But I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, Hannah showed us the photos she'd taken. One of them made my blood run cold. It was a shot of the clearing, but in the background, just beyond the trees, was a tall, distorted figure. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. "Did you see this when you took it?" I asked, my voice shaking. Hannah shook her head. "No, I swear it wasn't there." Travis dismissed it as a trick of the light, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Eli, of course, made a joke about Bigfoot, but even he seemed unsettled. By the time night fell, we were all on edge. The forest felt alive, pressing in on us with an almost tangible weight. The whispers returned, louder this time, and they weren't just random sounds, they were calling our names. "Jennifer," a voice hissed, soft and familiar. I froze, gripping the edge of my seat. "Did you hear that?" Eli nodded, his face pale. It said my name too. Travis grabbed the hatchet we'd been using to chop firewood. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping outside. "Don't," I begged, but he didn't listen. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then we heard it, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. Travis didn't come back. We locked the RV and huddled together, waiting for dawn. The thing outside clawed at the windows, whispering in Travis's voice, begging us to let it in. It wasn't until the first light of morning that the noises stopped. Hannah and I wanted to leave immediately, but the RV wouldn't start. Eli went outside to check the engine, and didn't come back. When we finally worked up the courage to look for him, all we found was his jacket, shredded and stained with blood. Hannah and I fled on foot, following the trail back to the main road. We didn't stop until we reached a ranger station hours later. When we tried to explain what had happened, the ranger just shook his head. "People go missing out there all the time," he said. "Best to stay away." As we drove home, I spotted a figure standing by the roadside. It looked like Eli, but his face was blank, expressionless. He raised a hand in a slow wave as we passed. I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't think I ever will. Some places aren't meant for people. Some places belong to something else entirely. My name is Wayne Anderson, and this happened to me on September 3rd, 1999. I was driving my RV through the dense forests of northern Idaho, seeking a weekend of peace and solitude. My wife, Jennifer, had recently left me, and I needed time to clear my head. The plan was to find a secluded spot near a lake and spend a few days fishing and reflecting. I found the perfect spot near Priest Lake, miles away from the nearest town. I parked my RV, set up my fishing gear, and lit a small campfire. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the water. The tranquility of the place began to seep into my bones, and for the first time in weeks I felt a semblance of peace. As darkness fell, I noticed a faint rustling in the underbrush. It was probably just a deer or a raccoon. I shrugged it off and went inside the RV to prepare dinner. While I was cooking, I heard the sound again, closer this time. I stepped out, flashlight in hand, and scanned the trees. Nothing, just the quiet chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The next day, I woke early and spent the morning fishing. The lake was calm, and I managed to catch a couple of trout. By noon, I was back at the campsite grilling the fish for lunch. I had just settled down to eat when I heard a loud crack like a branch snapping, followed by a low guttural sound. This time, it was unmistakable. Something was out there, watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and ventured into the woods. The underbrush was thick, and visibility was poor. I moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. After a few minutes, I found the source of the sound. A large branch lay broken on the ground, its splinters scattered around, but there was no sign of any animal. Feeling uneasy, I returned to the campsite. The rest of the day passed without incident, but the feeling of being watched never left me. That night I locked the RV door and double-checked the windows. I kept the knife close by, just in case. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud against the side of the RV. I jumped up, hard pounding, and listened. Silence. Then another thud, this time on the roof. I grabbed the flashlight and knife and climbed the ladder to the roof hatch. Slowly I pushed it open and shone the light around. The beam caught a glimpse of something moving, but it was too fast to see clearly. It disappeared, peering into the trees, leaving me with only the echo of its footsteps. I climbed down and decided it was time to leave. I started packing up my things, moving quickly but quietly. Suddenly, I heard a scream. It was a human scream, coming from deeper in the woods. My blood ran cold. I hesitated, torn between the urge to help and the fear of what might be out there. This scream came again, more desperate this time. I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed the flashlight and knife and ran toward the sound. The woods were dark and disorienting, but I followed the screams until I reached a small clearing. There I found a man, bloodied and barely conscious, lying on the ground. His clothes were torn and he had deep gashes across his chest. "Help me," he gasped, his voice weak. I knelt beside him and tried to assess his injuries. "What happened?" I asked. It got me," he whispered. "We have to get out of here." I helped him to his feet, and we made our way back to the campsite. He was in bad shape, and I knew we needed to get him to a hospital. I managed to get him into the RV and started driving toward the nearest town. As we drove, he told me his name was Tom, and that he had been hiking with his girlfriend when they were attacked by something. He didn't get a good look at it, but it was fast and strong. We reached the hospital in Sandpoint, and I explained what happened to the staff. They took Tom in immediately, and I was left in the waiting room, trying to make sense of everything. After a few hours, a doctor came out and told me that Tom would survive, but he was in critical condition. His girlfriend was still missing. I stayed in Sandpoint for a few days, hoping for news about Tom's girlfriend. The local authorities organized a search party, and I joined them. We combed the area around Priest Lake, but found no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. One evening, as I was sitting in a local diner, I overheard a conversation between two old-timers at the next table. They were talking about an old legend, something they called the Wendigo. According to them, it was a creature that lived in the forests, preying on humans. The description matched what little I had seen of the thing that attacked Tom. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Whatever it wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something dangerous. I decided to leave Idaho and never look back. I sold the RV and moved to a small town in Oregon, trying to put the whole ordeal behind me. But the memories never faded. I kept in touch with Tom, who eventually recovered, but he was never the same. The trauma of that night haunted him, and he struggled to move on. Years passed, and I tried to forget about what happened, but every now and then I'd hear stories about people going missing in the forests of Idaho, and I knew deep down that the Wendigo was still out there, waiting. One night, years later, I was sitting in my small Oregon home when I got a call from Tom. He sounded frantic, his voice shaking. "Wayne, it's back. I saw it." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. I was hiking near Priest Lake again. I thought it was all in my head, but it's real. It's real, and it's still there. I felt the chill run down my spine. "Tom, you need to stay away from there." "I know, but I had to see it for myself. I had to know if it was real." I could hear the fear in his voice, and it brought back all the memories of that night. "Tom, promise me you won't go back there." "I promise," he said, but I could tell he didn't mean it. The call ended, and I sat there in silence, staring at the phone. I knew Tom would go back. He was drawn to that place, just like I had been, and I knew he wouldn't be the last. A few weeks later, I got a call from Tom's sister. He had gone missing again, and this time they didn't find a body, just a trail of blood leading into the woods. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, the weight of it all crashing down on me. Tom was gone, and I knew he wouldn't be coming back. I decided to write down my story to warn others about the Wendigo. Maybe if people knew the truth, they would stay away from those cursed woods. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The forest had a way of drawing people in, and the Wendigo would always be there waiting. So if you ever find yourself near Priest Lake, remember my story. Stay away from the woods, and never ever go looking for the Wendigo, because once you see it, you'll never be the same again. Years have passed since then, and I've tried to move on with my life. But every time I close my eyes, I see those woods. I see Tom's bloodied face, and I hear the screams. The Wendigo took more than just my peace of mind. It took my friend, and it took a part of me that I'll never get back. So if you're ever out in the woods and you hear a rustling in the trees, don't ignore it. Be careful, because the Wendigo is still out there, and it's always watching, always waiting. And once it finds you, there's no escaping. This is my story, and I hope it serves as a warning. Stay safe, and never underestimate the darkness that lurks in the heart of the forest. My name is Randy Anderson, but everyone calls me Sousa. I'm 36 years old, and last fall I made the worst mistake of my life. I thought I was just going on another camping trip. I thought I needed peace, time to think, and space to heal after my divorce. But what I found in the Hercules Glades wilderness wasn't peace. It was something else entirely, something I still can't explain. This happened in October. The air was crisp, the leaves were fiery shades of red and orange, and the world felt quiet, as though it were holding its breath. I packed up my RV, a trusty old Ford I'd refurbished myself, and headed to a remote spot deep in the forest. I'd heard about the area from some travel blog. It mentioned breathtaking glades and a challenging hike to a place called Devil's Hollow, perfect for someone who wanted to be alone, or so I thought. The drive was beautiful but isolating. The farther I got from civilization, the narrower the roads became. I didn't pass another car for miles. When I finally reached the ranger station at the edge of the wilderness, I was greeted by an older woman with sharp, watchful eyes. Her name tag read Maggie. "You're going all the way out to Devil's Hollow?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. I shrugged. "That's the plan. Heard it's beautiful." "It's cursed," she said flatly. "Bad things happen there." I laughed nervously, unsure if she was joking. She wasn't. Her expression didn't change. "If you must go, stay out of the glade after sundown," Maggie warned. "The forest takes what it's owed." I brushed off her words as local folklore and left, eager to set up camp before dark. I parked the RV in a clearing not far from the main trail. The spot was perfect, quiet, secluded, and surrounded by towering trees that swayed gently in the breeze. I spent the evening setting up camp, cooking over a small fire, and trying to convince myself I'd made the right decision coming out here. The first sign of trouble came as I was falling asleep. I heard it faintly at first, a soft rustling outside the RV. Probably an animal, I thought. But then came the whispering. It wasn't words exactly, just faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to circle the RV. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound stopped as soon as I turned on the lights. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself. "Just your imagination." The next morning, I decided to hike to Devil's Hollow. It wasn't an official trail, which made it harder to navigate. My compass acted strangely, spinning lazily as if it couldn't find north. I chalked it up to a malfunction and kept going, using the sun to guide me. About halfway there, I ran into a man carrying a hunting rifle. He was tall and weathered, with a face that looked like it had seen more than it cared to. "You shouldn't be here," he said, blocking my path. "It's a public park," I replied, trying to sound confident. He shook his head. "Not this part. The glade isn't safe." "Why?" I asked, more annoyed than scared. His eyes narrowed. "You won't believe me if I tell you. Just don't stay out here after dark." Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into the trees. When I finally reached Devil's Hollow, I understood why people talked about it the way they did. The place didn't feel right. It was too quiet. No birds, no insects. Just an oppressive, eerie silence. The glade was a wide, open space surrounded by gnarled trees. In the center was a patch of scorched earth, as though a fire had burned there long ago. I took a few pictures, but my unease grew with every passing minute. Something about the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. I noticed strange symbols carved into the trees, circles, triangles, and spirals I couldn't decipher. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, circling the RV like a predator stalking its prey. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, and far too human for comfort. I locked the doors and peered through the window, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The beam caught a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound brave. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, and my blood turned to ice. The next morning, I found footprints around the RV, bare footprints too large to be human. My supplies were disturbed, and one of my chairs was gone. I decided I couldn't stay another night, but when I tried to start the RV, the battery was dead. No lights, no engine, nothing. Panic began to set in. That afternoon, I ventured back to the glade, hoping to find cell service or someone who could help. Instead, I found more signs of the supernatural, items scattered around the glade, a rusted pocket watch, a child's shoe, a shattered compass. None of them looked recent. Then I heard it, a voice calling my name. Sousa. It was faint but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from a person, it was coming from the trees. By nightfall, the spirits grew bolder. The RV shook violently as something clawed at the walls. The whispers turned into screams, familiar voices, voices from my past. My ex-husband's voice rang out cruel and mocking, echoing words he'd once said to me in anger. "You're nothing without me." I covered my ears, rocking back and forth, but the voices wouldn't stop. When the door to the RV slammed open, I grabbed a piece of firewood and ran. The forest seemed to shift as I fled, paths twisting and looping back on themselves. The shadows followed me, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. I stumbled into the glade, clutching the firewood like a weapon. In the center of the scorched earth was a book, a diary, its pages filled with frantic, illegible writing. Desperate, I tore out a page and lit it with my lighter. The moment the page burned, the shadows recoiled, screaming in a deafening chorus. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the road just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A ranger found me and took me to the station. I tried to explain, but my story sounded insane, even to me. Maggie was there, her expression unreadable. "You burned the book, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, too shaken to speak. She sighed. "It won't be the last time someone stumbles into Devil's Hollow. The forest always takes what it's owed." As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest was the same shadowy figure, its head tilted, watching me leave. I don't camp anymore. Some places aren't meant for people. Some places belong to something else entirely. I was already on edge when I heard the rustling in the bushes. Being a park ranger in the middle of Sequoia National Park is no walk in the park, no pun intended. My name's Colin Frank, and I've been patrolling these woods for nearly a decade. Usually it's the occasional bear or reckless camper that gives me trouble, but today was different. The day started like any other. I had my usual morning coffee in the ranger station, chatting with my colleague Tom Lear. He's a good guy, a bit younger than me, and still has that spark of excitement about the job. We joked about the old legends of the park, the ones about mysterious creatures lurking in the shadows. It was all in good fun until we got a call about a missing camper. "We've got a 1054 over at the Kings Canyon area," Thomas said, referring to the code for a missing person. "You up for it, Colin?" I nodded, grabbing my gear. "Let's go find this lost soul." The camper, a guy named Walter Tisdale, was last seen hiking alone 2 days ago. His friends reported him missing when he didn't return to their campsite. They described him as an experienced hiker, which made his disappearance all the more concerning. We drove to the trailhead and started our search. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every snap and crunch underfoot. Hours passed, and there was no sign of Walter. We split up to cover more ground, agreeing to check in every 30 minutes. It was during one of these solitary stretches that I first heard it, a strange rhythmic rustling. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. My curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the noise, my flashlight cutting through the dense foliage. Suddenly the rustling stopped. The silence was deafening. I scanned the area, heart pounding, when something caught my eye. A figure, half hidden behind a tree. I approached cautiously, calling out, "Walter, is that you?" The figure didn't respond. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a makeshift scarecrow, crudely assembled from branches and old clothes. But it wasn't the scarecrow itself that made my blood run cold. It was the fact that it was wearing Walter's hiking gear. I backed away slowly, reaching for my radio. "Thomas, you there? I found something. Might be a clue." Static. Then Thomas's voice crackled through. "What is it, Colin?" "I think someone's messing with us. I found a scarecrow dressed in Walter's clothes. I'm at the north end of the Kings Canyon Trail." "Stay put. I'm coming to you," Thomas replied. While waiting for Thomas, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Then, just as Thomas arrived, we heard a scream. A human scream. "Did you hear that?" Thomas asked, his face pale. I nodded, already moving toward the sound. We ran through the underbrush, the scream echoing again, louder this time. We burst into a small clearing and froze. In the center of the clearing was a cave entrance, and lying in front of it was Walter, or what was left of him. His body was mangled, torn apart by something with incredible strength. Thomas gagged, turning away while I forced myself to approach. "We need to call this in," I said, my voice shaking, "and we need to find out what did this." We radioed for backup and waited, weapons drawn, for what felt like an eternity. When reinforcements arrived, we explored the cave, hoping to find answers inside. The air was thick with the stench of decay. Bones, both animal and human, littered the ground. It was a slaughterhouse. And then we saw it. The creature was hunched over, gnawing on a bone. It looked up as we entered, its eyes reflecting the light from our flashlights. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, a grotesque amalgamation of features, part human, part beast. It let out a chilling screech and charged at us. We fired our weapons, the noise deafening in the confined space. The creature howled in pain, but it didn't stop. It lunged at Thomas, who dodged just in time. I aimed for its head, pulling the trigger repeatedly. Finally, it collapsed, a pool of dark blood spreading around it. We stood there panting as the reality of what had just happened sank in. "What the hell was that?" Thomas muttered, staring at the lifeless body. "I have no idea," I replied, "but we need to get out of here and report this back at the station." We were met with disbelief. The higher-ups were skeptical, to say the least. They sent a team to investigate the cave, but by the time they arrived, the creature's body was gone. Only the bones and the blood stains remained as evidence. The park was closed off and declared a restricted area. The official story was that a wild animal attack had claimed Walter's life, but Thomas and I knew the truth. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't just an animal, and it wasn't alone. The following weeks were a blur of debriefings and reports. Thomas and I were given time off, though it didn't feel like much of a break. I spent most of my days holed up in my apartment, trying to make sense of what happened. Every night, I replayed the events in my mind, wondering if there was something we missed. Then, one evening, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find a woman standing there, her face drawn and pale. "Are you Colin Frank?" she asked. "Yes. Can I help you?" "My name is Dr. Emily Cord. I'm a cryptozoologist. I heard about what happened in the park, and I think I know what you encountered." I invited her in, and she explained her theory. According to her research, the creature we saw matched descriptions of a legend known as the Shadow Beast. It was said to be an ancient predator, predating humans and surviving by hiding in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. They're incredibly rare, Dr. Cord said, but they do exist and they're very dangerous. I listened, trying to wrap my head around the idea. So what do we do about it? We need to find its lair and destroy it, she replied. If there's one, there could be more. Thomas and I agreed to help. Armed with new equipment provided by Dr. Cord, we returned to the park. This time, we were prepared. We moved cautiously through the forest, using thermal cameras and motion sensors to track any signs of movement. Hours passed with no activity, and I started to think we were on a wild goose chase. But then the sensors picked up something, a large heat signature moving towards us. We readied our weapons, hearts pounding. The creature emerged from the trees, but it wasn't alone. 2 more followed, their eyes glowing in the darkness. We opened fire, the sound of gunshots echoing through the forest. One of the creatures fell, but the others kept coming. Dr. Cord threw a flashbang, temporarily blinding them. We used the distraction to retreat to higher ground. From our vantage point, we could see the creatures circling below, searching for us. "We need to take them out before they find us," Thomas said, his voice steady. We coordinated our attack, using the thermal cameras to pinpoint their locations. One by one, we took them down until only silence remained. When it was over, we cautiously approached the bodies. Dr. Cord took samples, documenting everything for her research. "This should be enough to prove their existence," she said, sealing the samples in a container. "But we need to make sure there aren't any more." We spent the next few days combing the area, but there were no further signs of the creatures. It seemed we had eradicated the immediate threat. The park remained closed, with plans for a more thorough investigation. As we prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface. There were still so many unanswered questions. What were these creatures really? Where did they come from? And were there more out there, waiting? Thomas patted my shoulder. "We did good, Colin. We saved lives." "Yeah," I replied, watching the forest fade into the distance. But this place will never be the same. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Cord published her findings, and the story gained traction in scientific circles. The park remained under surveillance, and new safety protocols were put in place. As for me, I returned to my duties, keeping a vigilant eye on the woods. Life went on, but the memory of that day lingered, and though I never spoke of it, I knew deep down that the forest still held secrets waiting to be uncovered. My name is Bobby Smith. I'm 41 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I was tough enough to face anything. As a firefighter, I'd run into burning buildings without hesitation, confident I could control the chaos. That was before the accident, before a collapsing beam trapped me, forcing me to watch a child die in the flames. I walked away physically unscathed, but the guilt stayed with me. Now I live off-grid in my RV, drifting from one remote spot to another, trying to outrun memories that won't let me sleep. That's how I ended up at Seneca Rocks in West Virginia, chasing a rumor about a place called Devil's Hollow. A bartender at a rundown pub had mentioned it after a few beers, describing it as the kind of place that eats your soul. It sounded melodramatic, but the idea hooked me. Maybe the isolation would help. Maybe confronting something darker than my own mind would finally give me peace. I drove into the woods early on a foggy morning, the narrow road twisting like a serpent through dense trees. My RV bounced over potholes, the forest pressing closer with every mile. The air was heavy, damp with the scent of moss and decaying leaves. It felt like the kind of place the world forgot. Eventually, the road dead-ended in a clearing. I parked, stepped outside, and stretched, scanning the area. A rough trail led deeper into the woods, marked by a weathered sign that read, "Devil's Hollow. Keep out." Perfect. The kind of ominous warning I'd come to expect from overblown local legends. I grabbed my backpack, packed with a flashlight, a knife, and some snacks, and set off down the trail. The forest grew denser with every step. The trees gnarled and twisted as if trying to block my way. The wind didn't reach this far in. It was silent, except for the crunch of my boots on the leaf-strewn path. By mid-afternoon, I reached an old campsite. A fire pit, long cold, sat surrounded by rusted cans and scraps of cloth. A torn hiking boot lay in the dirt, its laces frayed. Nearby I found a tattered map folded against a rock. I picked it up. Furiously scrawled in the margin were 3 words, "Don't follow them." I frowned, glancing around. "Follow who?" I muttered, shoving the map into my pocket. I moved on, trying to shake the unease crawling up my spine. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees leaned closer, their bark cracked and blackened. Strange carvings appeared, faces twisted in agony, their mouths open as if screaming. By the time I set up camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the woods shrouded in twilight. I built a small fire and sat beside it, staring into the flames. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of crying. A woman's voice, soft and broken, coming from the trees. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my belt. "Hello?" I called, my voice rough in the still air. The crying stopped. I stood, shining my flashlight toward the sound. The beams sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but endless trees. "Anyone out there?" I called again, louder this time. Nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and my own breathing. I told myself it was probably an animal, some nocturnal bird or a trick of the wind. Still, I kept the knife close as I lay down for the night. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps outside my tent, slow, deliberate. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my flashlight and knife, crawling out of the tent as quietly as I could. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light over the campsite. That's when I saw her. A young woman stood at the edge of the clearing, barefoot and dirty, her long hair tangled with leaves. She looked at me with wide, damn, fearful eyes. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "don't go deeper." "Who are you?" I asked, my throat dry. "What are you doing out here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her figure swallowed by the darkness. I hesitated, every instinct telling me not to follow, but something about her felt off, like she didn't belong here any more than I did. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Against my better judgment, I packed up camp and followed her trail. The carvings on the trees grew more frequent and grotesque, the air heavier with each step. I felt like I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't turn back. Not yet. That's when I found it, a natural rock arch rising out of the forest floor, its surface covered in ancient-looking symbols. Beneath it lay a shallow pit filled with ash and bones. Human bones. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The ground felt wrong here, the air thick with something I couldn't name. As I stood there, the shadows seemed to shift, coalescing into a figure. It was massive, its body cloaked in darkness, its eyes burning red. The apparition didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and searing, as if it were peeling back my skin to look inside me. "You don't belong here," it said, its voice deep and rumbling like distant thunder. I ran. The forest closed in around me, the trees twisting into impossible shapes. The path I'd followed was gone, replaced by jagged rocks and thick underbrush. The creature's voice followed me, low and mocking, whispering my failures, my guilt, my pain. "You let her die," it hissed, the words striking like a whip. "You watched her burn." I tripped, falling hard onto the ground. When I looked up, the woman was there again, different now. Her face was pale and streaked with tears, her eyes hollow. "Help me," she begged, reaching out a hand. I hesitated. The creature's voice filled my head again. "You can't save her. You couldn't save anyone." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stand. "You're not real," I said, my voice shaking. "You're just in my head." The apparition laughed, a terrible sound that echoed through the hollow. "Everything here is real, Bobby, including your sins." I turned and ran again, ignoring the whispers, the shadows, the faces that seemed to form in the trees. When I finally stumbled back to my RV, I was bleeding and covered in scratches, but alive. The air felt lighter as I slammed the door shut and locked it. I drove out of those woods without looking back. Whatever had been in the hollow, ghost, demon, or something worse, it hadn't killed me, but it had left its mark. I still hear its voice sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, reminding me of what I've lost. I'll never go back to Devil's Hollow, and if you're smart, neither will you. My name is Sarah Russell, and I'm telling you about something that happened to me back in 2006, up near the remote stretches of the Boundary Waters in Minnesota. I'm an Ojibwe, which means I know these woods and waters like the back of my hand, but even with all that, I'm not so sure what I saw out there. I'd been working upstate for a few years, guiding out-of-towners through the lakes and keeping them out of trouble. Most of these folks think roughing it is skipping a lot, so I'm usually babysitting more than anything. Not that I mind. Easy enough work when the pay is good, but what happened on this trip was anything but easy. This particular group, the Lavins, was a married couple from Chicago, all fresh-faced and eager with their matching waterproof jackets and GPS gadgets. They didn't bring a tent, figuring it would be nice to sleep under the stars, which told me everything I needed to know. I insisted on grabbing an extra tarp from the truck before we set off. I didn't want to be out there longer than a couple of days, and I sure didn't want to end up bailing them out of some weather. The Lavins were fascinated by the wilderness, though, in that way that city folks are, asking what every rustle was, poking at animal tracks like they'd find gold under the mud, snapping photos of moss. By evening, they were tuckered out, and we set up camp by a lake surrounded by towering pines and thick tangled brush. It was as quiet as ever out there, the water perfectly still mirroring the trees in a way that always kind of got to me. We cooked up some dinner, and after the obligatory marshmallows, I headed for my own sleeping bag, only a few feet from theirs. Around midnight, I woke up. It wasn't anything obvious, not a noise or movement that I could say for sure, but my skin felt prickly, and my pulse was already up. The Lavins were out cold, not even a stir from their side of the tarp. I sat up slowly, straining to hear, but the forest was silent. It was the kind of quiet that felt wrong, like a giant had swallowed the night whole and left us hanging in some frozen snapshot of the woods. After a few minutes, I decided it was just me being jumpy, maybe something I ate. I tried lying down, but as soon as I closed my eyes, I felt something off. There was a smell in the air, faint but enough to hit the back of my throat, like a mix of rot and copper. I'd been in these woods long enough to know what decaying wildlife smelled like, but this was different. It was heavy and bitter, not natural. I sat up, looking around again, but there was nothing, no shapes, no rustling, no sign of anything out of place. Then I noticed a faint scraping sound, a low, dragging noise that seemed to come from the edge of the camp. I reached for my flashlight, but held it tight without switching it on. It was instinct, maybe. I wasn't sure I wanted to see whatever was out there. The Lavins were still sleeping, blissfully unaware of anything strange. I tried to decide if I should wake them up, but I didn't want to spook them over something I couldn't even identify myself. I was starting to think it was just an animal nosing around when I saw something at the edge of the light, a shape, low to the ground, shifting between the trees like it was crawling. Its limbs moved awkwardly, bending in a way that made my stomach twist. I'd seen plenty of wolves and bears out here, even the odd mountain lion, but this didn't fit. The size was all wrong. It was huge, but it slinked like it had no bones, slipping forward in fits and jerks, covering ground in silence, except for that scraping sound. I kept my flashlight pointed low, debating if I should shine it toward whatever this thing was. Just as I was about to turn it on, the thing stopped, crouched low as if it sensed me watching. For a second, it just sat there, its shape barely visible, a shadow against shadows. I held my breath, and then, as if on some unspoken signal, it started moving again, but toward the Lavins. That's when I made my move, clicking on the flashlight and aiming it right at the shape. For a second I caught a glimpse of it, a hunched figure, thick fur, matted and dark, but its limbs were long, with these stretched-out hands that didn't look right. They reminded me of raccoons, except scaled up and twisted, gnarled like tree roots. Its head whipped around to look at me, and that's when I felt the real fear settle in. I knew in that moment it wasn't anything I'd ever seen or heard about in these woods. The thing reared back, its body unfolding in a way that made it look even taller, bigger. It made this choking noise, something wet and ragged, and before I knew it, It lunged forward, faster than I'd have thought possible. I yelled, and the Lavins bolted up, looking around wildly, eyes huge in the beam of my flashlight. I told them to get up, to run, but they were frozen, their faces locked on that thing standing at the edge of our camp. It moved again, slinking back a few steps before it made a sound that I can only describe as laughter, if laughter was dragged through broken glass. The Lavins finally started moving, grabbing at their things while I kept the light on the creature. It stayed right where it was, watching us like it knew it didn't have to rush. We backed away slowly, keeping our flashlights trained on it, inching back through the trees. I kept checking over my shoulder, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what this thing wanted. It didn't act like an animal. It was too patient, too deliberate. As soon as we got far enough from camp, I turned and pushed the Lavins ahead, telling them to move as fast as they could. We stumbled through the dark, the trail barely visible, my heart pounding as I listened for any sign that it was following us, but it was too quiet. We kept moving, breaking into a run as soon as we thought we'd lost it. The Lavins were gasping for breath, tripping over roots and rocks, while I kept glancing back, half expecting to see it right on our heels. Somehow, we made it back to the truck. And I didn't waste a second starting it up, peeling out of there with the headlights slicing through the darkness. We drove for miles in silence, the Lavins too shaken to speak and me too wired to try. By the time we reached the ranger station, dawn was breaking, and the whole thing felt like some fever dream. But when I looked down at the truck's hood, there was a smear of that coppery dark stuff, a reminder that whatever it was, it had been real. I dropped the Lavins off, and they didn't say much, just a shaky thanks before they climbed into their car and took off back toward civilization. I couldn't blame them. That's what I should have done too, just turned around and left. But instead I spent the next few days digging into what I'd seen, asking around quietly, hoping maybe someone else had come across it before. I didn't find much, just whispers and fragments, stories that went back generations among the locals. They talked about something that lived in the deep woods, a creature that didn't belong to any known species. Some said it was a spirit. Others swore it was a protector of sorts, driving intruders away from certain parts of the forest. But what stuck with me was the name I kept hearing, one whispered with a kind of reverence, the Vishka. They said it was something old, older than any animal or spirit, something that didn't take kindly to people crossing its path. I don't know if that's what it was, or if it's just a story locals tell to keep folks out of places they don't want us. But whatever it was, I knew one thing. It was real. And it was out there somewhere in those woods, biding its time. And if I had to guess, it was still lurking, waiting for the next poor soul to wander too close. My name is Julian Richmond, and I'm 32 years old. This happened in October, deep in Chippewa National Forest, Minnesota. I was alone on what was supposed to be a week-long research trip for my job as a wildlife biologist. What I experienced out there is something I still can't explain. I'm sharing this because someone needs to hear it. Someone needs to know the truth about what's in those woods. I had driven my RV up to a remote site near Pimmy Lake, far from the usual tourist trails. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of weather that made me feel alive. I'd been studying declining wolf populations in the area and had planned to set up motion-triggered cameras along the trails. Wolves were elusive, but I'd always had patience. Alone time in the wilderness was something I craved, and it had never bothered me before. But from the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The first night was uneventful, though colder than I expected. I woke in the middle of the night to silence, not the usual peaceful stillness of the woods, but an oppressive, unnatural silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just jumpy from the long drive, but the feeling lingered. The second night, my RV's generator failed. I had plenty of fuel, but it simply wouldn't turn on. I fiddled with it for hours to no avail, eventually resorting to candles and my headlamp. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, thick and heavy. Around midnight I heard it for the first time, a low growl, distant but distinct. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the bark of a coyote. It was deeper, almost guttural. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out into the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the shadows. Nothing moved. Probably just a bear, I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded hollow in the quiet. The next morning, I found tracks near my campsite. They were massive, clawed prints sunk deep into the earth. At first I thought they belonged to a bear, but the spacing was all wrong, too far apart, as if whatever made them walked on two legs. Later that day, I met Henry. I'd gone for a hike to clear my head and stumbled upon his RV, parked in a small clearing about a mile away. He was outside chopping wood, his grizzled face set in a permanent scowl. "Didn't think anyone else was camped this far out," I said, trying to sound casual. Henry looked up, his eyes sharp and wary. "Not many people. Too quiet out here for most folks." I laughed nervously. "That's why I like it." He sat down his axe and wiped his hands on his pants. "You shouldn't be here," he said bluntly. I frowned. "Why not?" Henry glanced toward the trees, his expression darkening. "This forest, it's not right. People vanish out here, hear things they shouldn't. You'd do well to pack up and leave." I wanted to ask more, but his tone made it clear he wasn't interested in conversation. Still, his words stuck with me as I made my way back to my campsite. That night, things escalated. I woke to a strange sound, like someone whispering just outside the RV. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by the same low growl I'd heard the night before. This time it was closer, much closer. I grabbed the hunting knife I always kept by my bed and slowly opened the RV door. The forest was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. My flashlight's beam flickered as I swept it across the campsite. That's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, just beyond the tree line. They were too high off the ground to be wolves and too far apart to be anything I could recognize. My breath caught, and I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. The next morning I found Sasha. I'd driven into the forest further than I should have, hoping to outrun whatever was happening. Instead, I came across her, alone, sitting on a rock near a trailhead, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Are you okay?" I asked, pulling over. Sasha looked up, her face pale and streaked with dirt. "I'm lost," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been walking for hours. I can't find the trail back." I offered her a ride, and she climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her pack like a lifeline. She seemed jittery, her eyes darting toward the trees as if she expected something to jump out at any moment. "What happened?" I asked as we drove. Sasha hesitated, then whispered, "I heard someone calling my name. I thought it was my brother, but he wasn't here. I kept hearing it, though, over and over. That night, the Wendigo came. Henry had warned me earlier that day when we ran into him again. It's the hunger," he said, his voice low and grim. "That thing preys on the lonely, the lost. You hear it calling your name. You don't answer. You see it in the trees. You run." I didn't understand how literal his warning was until it was too late. Sasha and I had parked near a ranger station, hoping to find help in the morning. We were both exhausted, but neither of us could sleep. The air was bitterly cold, colder than it should have been for October. Frost coated the inside of the RV windows, and the whispers started again. Julian, my name, faint but insistent, came from the woods. "Don't listen," Sasha hissed, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, gripping the knife tightly. The whispers grew louder, joined by the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching. And then we saw it. The creature was emaciated, its limbs impossibly long, its pale skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was a grotesque mask with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its head tilting slowly as it watched us. "Run," I whispered, pushing Sasha toward the door. We bolted into the forest, the Wendigo's guttural growl echoing behind us. It moved unnaturally fast, its movements jerky and inhuman. Henry saved us, or tried to. He appeared out of nowhere, his rifle aimed squarely at the creature. "Go," he shouted. "I'll hold it off." We didn't argue. Sasha and I ran, the sound of gunshots ringing out behind us, but the growls didn't stop. When we reached the RV, Henry was gone. There was no sign of him, no sound but the wind rustling through the trees. Sasha and I escaped the forest the next morning, driving straight to the nearest ranger station. The rangers didn't believe us, of course. They wrote it off as stress or exhaustion, questioning, saying Henry had likely been attacked by a bear. But I know the truth. Some nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I hear it again, my name whispered in the dark, and I know it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. My name is Hannah Alvarez, and I'm 34 years old. This happened last summer, during what I thought would be just another adventure to fuel my travel blog. I've spent the better part of my career exploring hidden gems and offbeat places, but nothing, not even the ghost tours in Savannah or the creepy hotels in New Orleans, could have prepared me for Enchanted Rock. I pulled my RV into the campsite just before noon. Enchanted Rock rose in the distance, a massive pink granite dome that glowed faintly under the Texas sun. I'd been here once as a kid, but I couldn't remember much beyond the climb and my mom yelling at me to stay close. This time I was alone, and I planned to capture every bit of its beauty. After parking in a secluded spot, I grabbed my camera and gear, excited to scout the area. The plan was simple: hike to the summit, take some photos, and interview a few locals about the legends. The place had plenty of them. Ancient curses, ghostly sightings, and strange disappearances, perfect fodder for a post that would rake in clicks. I checked in at the visitor center where I met Maggie, a park ranger who looked to be in her late 50s. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and had a weathered face that reminded me of an old cowboy movie. "First time here?" she asked, her tone friendly but measured. "First time as an adult," I said, smiling. "I'm a travel writer, and I wanted to cover some of the stories about the Rock, you know, the spooky stuff." Her expression shifted slightly. "It's a beautiful place, but you need to respect it, especially after dark." "Why? Is it really haunted?" I teased. She hesitated before answering. "There are things here older than you can imagine. The Tonkawa people believe this was a sacred site. They say a warrior cursed it before he died. I've seen enough strange things to believe there's truth to it." I laughed nervously. "Well, I'm not planning to anger any spirits." Her gaze lingered on me, her eyes serious. "Just don't wander too far off, and if you hear drumming, go the other way." I dismissed her warning as local folklore meant to entertain tourists, but as I hiked up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Rock was watching me. The path twisted through clusters of boulders and dry scrub, the air hot and still. Occasionally I'd hear a bird or the rustle of a lizard darting through the brush, but otherwise it was unnervingly quiet. About halfway up, I noticed something strange, symbols etched into the granite. They were rough and jagged, like they'd been scratched in haste, and they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. I snapped a few photos, thinking they'd make for a good mystery in my blog. Then, for no reason I could explain, a chill ran down my spine. It was the middle of the day, blazing hot, but the air felt cold and heavy. I brushed it off as nerves and kept climbing. When I reached the summit, the view was breathtaking. The horizon stretched endlessly, the land below dotted with patches of green and the occasional shimmer of water. I set up my tripod and began taking pictures, losing myself in the work. That's when I heard it, a faint drumming sound carried on the wind. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't loud, just a low, steady rhythm, but it seemed to come from all around me. "Maggie was just trying to spook you," I muttered, shaking my head, but the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got louder, more insistent. I packed up quickly and started back down the trail, my nerves on edge. The shadows seemed darker now, the shapes of the rocks more menacing. I told myself I was imagining things, that there was a rational explanation for the sound. Maybe someone was drumming at the base of the rock, but deep down, I knew better. That night, I stayed in my RV editing the photos I'd taken. They were stunning, capturing the eerie beauty of the landscape perfectly. But when I scrolled through the shots of the summit, I stopped cold. In one of the pictures taken at the edge of the overlook, there was a figure. It was faint, barely visible, but unmistakably there. A tall, shadowy shape that hadn't been there when I snapped the shot. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Was it a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera? I tried to rationalize it, But the memory of that drumming filled my mind, and suddenly I didn't feel so alone. The first knock came around midnight, soft, tentative, like someone tapping on the side of the RV. My blood turned to ice. I froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. Grabbing a flashlight, I moved to the window and peered outside. The campsite was empty, nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the trees. Then I saw it, etched into the side of the RV, that same symbol I'd seen on the rock earlier that day. My hands trembled as I stepped back, my mind racing. Someone was messing with me, they had to be, but deep down I knew this wasn't a prank. The next morning, I drove to town and asked around about the symbols. Most people didn't recognize them, but an older man at a coffee shop told me they looked like warnings used by the Tonkawa. They marked sacred places, he said, places where the spirits were restless. The word restless stuck with me. On a whim, I stopped by the visitor center and found Maggie. When I told her what had happened, she frowned deeply. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm. "The rock isn't just a place, it's alive, and you've drawn its attention." "Attention?" I repeated, my stomach sinking. "You've disturbed something that doesn't want to be disturbed." I didn't leave. I should have, but my curiosity and my pride kept me there. That night the drumming returned, louder and closer than before. The air inside the RV felt suffocating, thick with an invisible weight. I tried to sleep but kept waking to strange noises, footsteps circling the RV, faint whispers just outside the door. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, determined to confront whatever, or whoever, was tormenting me. The campsite was shrouded in darkness, the trees casting long, jagged shadows as I shone the light around. I spotted something near the edge of the clearing, an altar of stones arranged in a circle. In the center was a bundle of feathers and bones, tied with twine. My breath caught. The drumming grew louder, echoing in my ears, and then I saw him, the shadowy figure from my photo. He stood just beyond the altar, his form shifting and flickering like smoke. "You're not real," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." But then he moved, stepping closer. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and the air grew colder with each step. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and the flashlight rolled out of my hand. "Leave!" a voice hissed, deep and guttural, reverberating through the clearing. Scrambling to my feet, I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. The drumming stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. At dawn, I packed up and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing on the summit, watching me. I've written about many places since then, but I'll never return to Enchanted Rock. Some things are meant to remain untouched, their stories told in whispers and warnings. And if you ever visit, take Maggie's advice. If you hear drumming, go the other way. My name is Grayson Gomez and I'm 29 years old. This happened last October when I took my RV to Red Lake Petland in Minnesota for a solo trip. I'm a freelance travel writer and photographer, and I was chasing a story about one of the most untouched, eerie landscapes in the country. I thought it would be just another job, a chance to snap some photos, write a poetic description of misty bogs and call it a day. I couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived at the edge of the bog in the late afternoon. The narrow dirt road leading to the campsite was rougher than I expected, and the RV's tires sank slightly in the damp, muddy ground. The air felt heavy, laden with the smell of decaying vegetation and stagnant water. I parked where the road widened into a makeshift lot, unable to get closer to the marked trails. My plan was to hike in with my camera gear and come back to the RV to write notes at night. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no wind, just an oppressive stillness, broken only by the occasional squelch of my boots in the mud. I dismissed the unease gnawing at me and focused on setting up my camera. The light filtering through the mist was perfect, soft and golden, illuminating the strange, otherworldly beauty of the bog. I ventured deeper, snapping shots of twisted trees, moss-covered hummocks, and pools of water that mirrored the pale sky. That's when I saw it. Hanging from a branch ahead was a small doll, crudely made of sticks and wrapped in dirty fabric. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. I stopped and stared at it, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It looked like some kind of voodoo charm, but this wasn't Louisiana. It was Minnesota. Just local kids messing around, I muttered, though the words didn't make me feel any better. I took a photo of it for context and kept walking. The mist thickened as the sun sank lower. I'd planned to head back before dark, but the trails seemed to twist and shift, leading me in circles. My GPS showed me moving in the right direction, yet I kept passing the same tree with the hanging doll. The logical part of my brain told me I was tired and misreading the landmarks, but a deeper, instinctual part of me felt watched. The first whisper came as I stopped to check my map. Grayson, my name, faint and drawn out, drifted through the mist. I froze, my breath catching. "Hello?" I called, turning in a slow circle. My flashlight beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but trees and water. Grayson, it came again, from a different direction, closer this time. My pulse quickened. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here. The parking lot was empty when I arrived, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I packed up my gear in record time and retraced my steps as best I could, refusing to look back at the whispering voice. By the time I reached the RV, the mist had swallowed the entire area. I locked the door behind me, pulled the curtains shut, and turned on every light I had. I told myself it was just my imagination, a mix of fatigue and isolation playing tricks on me. But when I reviewed the photos I'd taken, my stomach sank. Half the images were distorted, warped by static-like streaks that hadn't been visible in my viewfinder. In one shot, the photo of the doll, there was something else behind it. Half shrouded in the mist stood a figure, a woman, her face obscured by a tangle of dark hair, her body draped in rags. She was turned toward the camera, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. I shut my laptop and poured myself a stiff drink, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a quirk of the lens. But the image was burned into my mind. The next morning I decided to venture into town. The air outside was heavy and damp, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I pulled out of the lot, an elderly woman flagged me down from the side of the road. She wore a long coat and a knit hat, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp. I rolled down my window and she leaned in, her gaze piercing. "You've been to the bog," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied uneasily. "I'm working on a story." She frowned, shaking her head. "You shouldn't be out there. That place isn't safe. It's cursed." I stiffened. "Cursed? You mean the doll I found?" Her eyes widened. "You touched it?" "No, I just photographed it." The woman crossed herself and muttered something under her breath. "The witch doesn't like to be disturbed," she said. "She'll make sure you don't leave." Before I could ask what she meant, she walked away, vanishing into the mist. By the time I returned to the bog that afternoon, the air was colder, the silence even more oppressive. My GPS worked fine in town, but became unreliable again as soon as I parked. I decided to stick close to the trail this time, but that didn't stop the whispers. Grayson. They came from every direction, each one more insistent than the last. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my work. But then I saw her. The figure from the photograph stood in the distance, her silhouette barely visible through the mist. She didn't move, but seemed to watch me, her presence pulling at something deep and primal in my chest. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the water. Against my better judgment, I followed her gesture, stepping closer to the edge of the bog. The water was dark, reflecting nothing, and as I stared, shapes began to form beneath the surface, faces distorted, anguished, their mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The final straw came that evening. I was packing up my gear when a young man stumbled out of the mist, his face pale and panicked. "Are you Grayson?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," I said warily. "Who are you?" "Zach. I'm an intern at the park. I came to check on you after Ruby, the old lady in town, said you might be in trouble." I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more unnerved. Zach was friendly enough, but he seemed spooked, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "We shouldn't stay here," he said. "The stories, they're true. People disappear in this bog. You need to leave." I nodded, grateful for the company, and we started back toward the RV. But the mist thickened, swallowing the trail entirely. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. Zach froze. "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, a shadow moved in the corner of my vision. The woman stepped out of the mist, her hollow eyes locking onto Zach. He screamed as she lunged toward him, her form twisting and stretching unnaturally. "Run!" Zach shouted, and I didn't hesitate. I sprinted through the mist, my heart hammering. The whispers were deafening now, accusing me, pleading with me. "Why did you leave me, Grayson?" One voice cried, eerily familiar. I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping for breath. The RV was right where I'd left it, and I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get inside. As I started the engine, I glanced back toward the trail. The woman stood at the edge of the lot, her rags billowing in an unseen wind. She didn't move, but I could feel her hatred, her hunger, as if she was willing me to step out. I slammed the door shut and sped away, the mist chasing me until I hit the main road. I never went back to Red Lake Petland, but the bog never left me. The photos I took that week are distorted beyond recognition, except for one. It's a clear shot of the woman standing in the water, her eyes fixed on the camera. Sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice. It's faint, but it's always there, whispering my name, and I know deep down that the bog is still waiting for me to return. My name is Julian Moody, and I'm 37 years old. This happened in July when my wife Lila, our 12-year-old daughter Kara, and my younger brother Matt decided to camp in Paul Bunyan State Forest, Minnesota. What started as a peaceful family getaway turned into a nightmare, one I still wake from in a cold sweat, hearing Kara's voice calling from the woods. It was my idea to camp there. I'd read about its rugged trails and unspoiled beauty, a perfect escape from our busy lives. Lila agreed, eager to sketch the landscape, and Kara couldn't wait to explore. Matt was a wild card, an adrenaline junkie who loved mocking my love for careful planning. I should have known better. I'd heard stories about Devil's Hollow, an area deep within the forest with an evil reputation, but I dismissed them as local legend. I shouldn't have. We arrived mid-morning on a Friday. The air was crisp, the trees tall and majestic, and the drive-in had been uneventful. The dirt road leading to our campsite wound through dense woods, the kind that seemed to whisper when the wind blew. Our spot was secluded, with just enough space for our RV and Matt's pop-up tent. After setting up, Kara immediately took off to explore, her curiosity as boundless as her energy. "Kara!" I called after her. "Stay where we can see you," she waved me off. "I'm just looking at the trees, Dad." Lila gave me a look, part amused, part exasperated. "Let her be, Julian. She's 12, not 2. Matt chuckled. "Relax, big bro. What's the worst that could happen?" That night, the worst began. It started with a storm. Matt's cheap tent leaked like a sieve, so he ended up in the RV with us. He grumbled, blaming me for his misery because I'd picked the middle of nowhere for our trip. Lila ignored him, sketching by flashlight, and Kara lay curled up on the RV's bench seat, fast asleep. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first I thought it was Kara heading to the bathroom, but when I checked, she was still sleeping. The footsteps were outside, circling the RV, slow and deliberate. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding rain. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Lila. She nodded, her eyes wide. "It's probably an animal," she said, though her voice wavered. Matt, oblivious, snored loudly from the bunk above. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the RV door, peering into the night. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the campsite. Nothing. No movement, no sound but the rain. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. The next day, Kara found the dolls. She'd wandered off again while we prepared breakfast, her curiosity always getting the better of her. When she returned, she held a small wooden figure in her hand. It was crudely carved from some kind of dark wood, with exaggerated feet, eyes wide with fear, and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. "Look what I found," she said, grinning. Lila frowned. "Where did you get that?" By the trail, there were a bunch of them, half buried in the dirt. Can I keep it? No, I said too sharply. Put it back where you found it. Kara's face fell. It's just a doll. Leela placed a hand on her shoulder. That's right, sweetheart. It's not ours to take. Grumbling, Kara trudged back to the trail. When she returned, she seemed distant, distracted. I told myself she was just sulking, but later, when I saw her drawing the doll in her notebook, I wondered if it had left more of an impression than she'd let on. The forest grew stranger the longer we stayed. Matt's GPS stopped working, and my phone's compass spun uselessly. Lila's watch froze at 3:17 p.m. Trails we'd followed easily on our first day seemed unfamiliar, their landmarks shifting. Kara started talking about an imaginary friend she'd met in the woods. He's tall and funny, she said at dinner. He knows all about the forest. Lila exchanged a glance with me. What's his name? She asked. He didn't say, Kara replied, poking at her food. But he showed me a secret place. Can I go there tomorrow? No, I said firmly. You're staying with us from now on. Kara rolled her eyes but didn't argue. That night I woke to the sound of laughter. It was faint, drifting through the trees, high-pitched and childlike. For a moment I thought it was Kara, but when I checked she was fast asleep. The laughter continued, distant yet unmistakable. By the third day I was ready to leave. The forest felt alive, its shadows darker, its silence heavier. Matt laughed off my concerns, calling me paranoid. It's just the woods, Derek. You're letting your imagination run wild. But even he couldn't explain the claw marks we found on the RV that morning, long and deep, gouged into the metal. Kara, did you see any animals around last night? I asked. She shook her head. No, but my friend says we shouldn't be here. Your friend? Lila asked sharply. What did he say? Kara hesitated. He says this place isn't for us. He wants me to stay, though. He said I could play forever. My blood ran cold. Kara, stop talking to this friend. He's not real. Her lip quivered. He is real, and he's mad at you. That evening, Kara disappeared. We'd been packing up to leave when she wandered off again. I called her name until my throat was raw, my panic growing with each unanswered shout. Lila was hysterical, Matt uncharacteristically silent. We searched for hours, deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone. We found her at sunset, standing in the clearing, holding another wooden doll. Her face was blank, her eyes glassy. Lila ran to her, pulling her into a hug, but Kara didn't respond. She just stared ahead, unblinking. She's fine, Matt said. She probably just... Shut up, Matt, I said. We need to get out of here. Now. That night, the spirit came for us. Kara was tucked into the RV, her eyes still vacant. Lila and I stood watch, knives clutched in trembling hands. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, circling the RV, joined by laughter and whispers. Julian, the voice was soft, familiar. It was Kara's voice, but Kara was inside the RV. The door rattled as if someone was trying to open it. Lila clutched my arm. Don't let it in, she whispered. The rattling stopped and the shadow appeared. A figure tall and thin, its limbs wrong, its face smooth and pale. It stared at us through the window, its head tilting unnaturally. Go away, I shouted, brandishing the knife. The shadow didn't move. Then it spoke. Stay with us, Kara. Play forever. My blood turned to ice. You can't have her. The shadow melted into the darkness, but the laughter remained, growing louder, closer. I knew then we couldn't stay. The forest wanted Kara. It wouldn't stop until it had her. We fled to Devil's Hollow, the place Kara's friend had shown her. It was the only way to end this. The clearing was filled with wooden dolls, hundreds of them, each carved with a child's terrified face. Lila knelt, arranging a circle of salt and herbs while I held Kara close. Let them go. Lila shouted into the night. Release them! The air grew icy, the laughter turning to screams. The shadow reappeared, larger now, its form twisting and shifting. It reached for Kara, but Lila stood her ground, chanting words I didn't understand. The shadow faltered, its edges blurring. Matt, ignoring my protests, grabbed one of the dolls and set it on fire. The flames roared to life, spreading to the others. The shadow let out an unearthly wail, its form collapsing into itself. The screams faded, the forest falling silent. Kara blinked, her expression clearing. Dad, she whispered. It's okay, I said, tears streaming down my face. You're safe now. We left that night, vowing never to return, but the hollow stayed with us. Kara refuses to talk about her friend, though I've caught her drawing him, a tall, shadowy figure lurking in the background. Lila says we did the right thing, but I'm not so sure. The forest took something from us, something intangible but vital. Sometimes late at night I hear the laughter again. My name is Matthew Woodward. I'm 38 years old, and this happened in October of 2022. I've always loved exploring off-the-beaten-path destinations in my RV, documenting my trips for the travel blog I've been running for years. My niche is spooky or unusual locations, haunted campgrounds, forgotten ghost towns, that sort of thing. This time, my curiosity led me to Whitewater State Park in southeastern Minnesota. It's a beautiful place, all rolling bluffs, hardwood forests and limestone cliffs, but it's also known for its Native American burial mounds and the strange stories surrounding them, disappearances, sightings of ghostly figures, and warnings not to disturb the land. I thought I'd debunk the myths like I usually do. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived at Whitewater, the weather was perfect, crisp air, the trees glowing with red and gold leaves, and just enough breeze to make the woods feel alive. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near a trailhead, far enough from other campers to enjoy some peace and quiet. The first person I met was Jim Miller, a ranger who manned the visitor center. He was in his mid-50s, stocky, with a sun-weathered face and sharp blue eyes. Jim struck me as one of those people who know everything there is to know about their patch of land. "You're here to write about the mounds, aren't you?" he said, eyeing the camera slung around my neck. I smiled. "You caught me." Jim frowned, leaning on the counter. "You'd do well to leave them alone. The mounds aren't just old dirt, they're sacred. And folks who mess with them, well, things tend to go wrong." "Things like what?" Jim hesitated, glancing out the window as if he expected someone to overhear. "Strange noises, people getting lost, sometimes worse. Last year a college kid went missing after camping near Spirit's Rise, never found a trace of him." I felt a chill but brushed it off. "I'll be careful." He sighed, then handed me a trail map. "Stick to the marked paths, and if you hear someone calling your name out there, don't answer." I laughed nervously. "Got it." The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked some trails, took photos of the river winding through the valley, and noted a few spots where I could set up my tripod for sunrise shots. By evening I was back in my RV, cozy with a bowl of soup and my notes. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I heard a soft tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, my heart racing. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bird or a curious raccoon, but the tapping came again, louder this time, and when I glanced at the window, I swore I saw a faint shadow move across it. "Who's there?" I called out, fumbling for my flashlight. There was no reply, just the rustling of leaves outside. When I mustered the courage to peek out, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the wind and went back to bed, though I barely slept. The next morning I decided to hike to Spirit's Rise, the largest and most infamous burial mound in the park. Jim's warning gnawed at me, but I couldn't resist. If I wanted to write a good story, I needed photos. The trail was beautiful, but eerily quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels rustled through the underbrush. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. When I reached the mound, I was struck by its sheer presence. It wasn't just a hill, it felt alive, as though the ground was pulsing faintly beneath my feet. A ring of old oaks surrounded it, their twisted branches casting long shadows. I raised my camera to take a photo, but the screen flickered and went black. I muttered a curse, fiddling with the buttons, but it wouldn't turn back on. That's when I heard the whisper, "Matthew." It was faint, barely audible over the breeze, but unmistakable. My name. I spun around searching for the source, but the trail was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Feeling a sudden wave of unease, I turned and hurried back down the trail, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel. But the further I walked, the more the path seemed to change. The twists and turns didn't match what I remembered. My GPS showed nothing but a spinning icon. By the time I found my way back to the RV, the sun was low in the sky, and my nerves were shot. I tried to shake off the fear, focusing instead on making dinner and organizing my notes. But that night, the knocking came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was on the door. I froze, gripping the edge of the table. Who is it? No reply. Just another knock, louder this time. My hand trembled as I grabbed the flashlight and swung the door open. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. The campsite was empty, the woods silent. As I backed into the RV, I noticed something chilling, a single handprint on the window, small, like that of a child. The next morning I sought out Jim, desperate for answers. He listened quietly as I described the whispers, the knocking, the handprint. "You went to Spirit's Rise, didn't you?" he said, his voice flat. I nodded, guilt bubbling in my chest. "You disturbed them," he said. "You've been marked." "Marked for what?" Jim shook his head. "The spirits protect the mounds. Sometimes they warn people to leave. Sometimes—" He trailed off, his gaze distant. "You need to give something back. An offering, flowers, a token, anything to show respect." I didn't fully believe him, but what choice did I have? That evening, I returned to Spirit's Rise with a small bundle of wildflowers and an old bracelet that had belonged to my mother. I wasn't sure what to do, so I placed them at the base of the mound and murmured an apology. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air grew heavy, and the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the trees. I turned to leave, but a figure blocked the path. It was a boy, no older than 10, with pale skin and hollow eyes. He stared at me, his mouth moving soundlessly. "Are you lost?" I managed to whisper. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he pointed to the mound, his expression blank. When I looked back at him, he was gone. That night, the activity escalated. I was jolted awake by a loud crash, as though something had struck the side of the RV. My flashlight flickered erratically as I scanned the interior. The air felt icy, my breath visible in the dim light. Then I saw him again. The boy stood in the corner of the RV, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His lips moved, but no sound came out. When I stepped toward him, his face twisted into a horrifying scream and he vanished, leaving behind a faint trail of frost. I knew I couldn't stay another night. At dawn, I packed up and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Panicking, I grabbed my map and decided to hike back to the visitor center, hoping to find Jim. But the forest had other plans. The trail warped around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at my jacket. The whispers became a cacophony, drowning out my thoughts. And then I saw it, a clearing filled with old belongings, rusted lanterns, broken tents, and even a weathered RV overtaken by moss. In the center stood a stone altar, dark and slick, as though something had recently been spilled there. The boy's voice cut through the chaos. "Help me." He stood by the altar, his pale hand reaching out. I wanted to run, but my feet carried me forward. As I approached, the air grew colder, and a shadow began to rise from the altar. It was tall, featureless, and radiating a malevolent energy that made my chest tighten. The boy disappeared, replaced by the shadow, which advanced on me, its form shifting like smoke. Heart pounding, I fumbled in my bag and pulled out the bracelet I'd brought earlier, holding it high. "I'm sorry, please take it," I shouted. The shadow paused, its form wavering. Slowly it retreated, dissolving into the cold air. The whispers faded. When I stumbled back to the visitor center hours later, Jim was gone. Another ranger told me there hadn't been a Jim Miller on staff in years. A plaque near the entrance listed his name. He'd vanished in the woods decades ago, presumed dead. I left Whitewater that day, swearing never to return. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. This happened in late November during the last stretch of a solo photography trip. I'll never forget it. My name is Grant Miller and I'm 40 years old. I've spent most of my adult life chasing the perfect shot, the kind of photo that makes people stop and see the world differently. But over the last few years, the spark has been fading. The photographs all felt the same, and I started to wonder if my best work was behind me. That's why I went to Red Lake Wildlife Management Area, a sprawling wetland in northwestern Minnesota. I'd heard it was stunning, a place where nature seemed untouched by time. I wanted isolation, inspiration, and maybe a few shots to reinvigorate my portfolio. What I found instead was something I still can't explain. I pulled into the park late in the afternoon. The lot was empty, except for a small rusty sedan near the visitor kiosk. A middle-aged man with a worn jacket and a trucker cap stood leaning against it, sipping from a thermos. "You heading into the marshes?" he asked as I stepped out of my RV. His voice had a rough edge, the kind that comes from years of cigarettes or shouting into the wind. "Thinking about it," I said, grabbing my camera bag. He squinted at me, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Be careful out there. Strange things happen in those wetlands, especially this time of year." "What kind of strange things?" "The kind you don't want to meet. Ever hear about the Devil's Song?" I shook my head, half smiling. "Nope, but it sounds like the setup to a good campfire story." His expression didn't change. "It ain't a story. Folks around here know better than to listen. If you hear music, you walk the other way. And if you see something following you—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, it's best not to see it at all." I laughed nervously, more out of politeness than amusement, and thanked him for the warning. As I drove into the park, his words lingered in my mind. I found a secluded spot near the wetlands to park the RV. The view was breathtaking, reeds swaying gently in the breeze, the golden light of sunset reflecting off the still water. The marsh stretched out like a painting, dotted with clusters of skeletal trees that reached for the sky like twisted fingers. I set up my gear and snapped a few photos. As the sun dipped lower, the camera felt good in my hands, familiar and grounding. For a moment I forgot about the man's warning and lost myself in the work. But as twilight deepened, the stillness of the marsh began to unnerve me. There was no wind, no chirping of crickets or rustling of small animals, just an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional splash of water too far away to see. That's when I heard it, a melody, soft and distant, drifting through the air like smoke. It was hauntingly beautiful, the kind of sound that pulls at something deep inside you. At first I thought it was coming from a bird or maybe someone playing music at another campsite, but as I listened I realized it wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around me. I dismissed it as my imagination and went to bed early, but the melody followed me into my dreams. I woke in a sweat, the song echoing in my ears like the hum of a tuning fork. The next morning I shook it off and decided to hike deeper into the marshes. If I could capture the stillness, the isolation of this place, maybe it would spark something in me. As I trudged through the reeds, the melody returned, faint but unmistakable. It sounded different this time, almost familiar. The further I walked, the clearer it became, weaving together fragments of music from my past, the lullaby my grandmother used to sing, the song my ex-wife played on repeat when we first started dating. By the time I reached a clearing in the wetlands, the melody had grown louder. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, pressing against me like an invisible hand. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and thin, with no discernible features. His form seemed to shimmer like heat rising off pavement. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. I fumbled for my camera, snapping a few shots to prove to myself later that this was real. But when I lowered the lens, the figure was gone. Back at the RV, I reviewed the photos. The figure wasn't there. Every shot showed the clearing exactly as it had been, empty, desolate, untouched. That night the melody grew louder. It didn't just float through the air this time. It invaded the RV, vibrating through the walls like the hum of a distant engine. I tried covering my ears, but it didn't help. Then the fog started. It rolled in thick and fast, wrapping around the RV until I couldn't see a foot beyond the windows. Shapes moved within it, flickering like shadows on a screen. My heart pounded as I caught glimpses of something tall and angular circling the RV. I stayed inside all night, too scared to move. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were too large, too deep, as though something impossibly heavy had walked through the clearing. I decided to leave, but when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but the RV wouldn't start. The melody swelled, a taunting, mocking sound that seemed to laugh at my frustration. With no other option, I grabbed my gear and headed back into the wetlands, hoping to find help or at least a signal for my phone. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The reeds seemed taller, the water darker, the trees more gnarled. The air grew heavy, making each step feel like wading through thick mud. Eventually I stumbled upon an abandoned hunting cabin, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Inside I found a journal covered in mildew, the pages brittle with age. The entries were written in a shaky hand, detailing the story of a hunter who had come to the marshes decades ago. He'd heard the melody just as I had and followed it to its source, a deal with something he called the Shadow Man. The melody promised success, fame, everything the hunter desired, but the cost was his soul. The final entry read, "He follows me now. I hear the song every day. I am his, and soon you will be too." I heard a creak behind me and froze. Turning slowly, I saw the Shadow Man standing in the doorway. He was taller now, more solid. His featureless face tilted as though he was studying me. The melody swelled to a deafening crescendo as he stepped closer, his long, spindly fingers reaching out. "No!" I shouted, stumbling backward. I grabbed a flare from my bag and struck it. The red light cast eerie shadows across the cabin. The Shadow Man recoiled, his form flickering like a dying flame. Without thinking, I ran. The melody chased me through the marshes, twisting and warping into something monstrous. It wasn't music anymore, it was a scream, a cacophony of voices clawing at my mind. I reached the edge of the wetlands and saw it, a gnarled tree rising from the water, its bark blackened and twisted. The melody seemed to emanate from it, vibrating through the air like a pulse. With shaking hands, I struck another flare and hurled it at the tree. The flames caught instantly. Racing up the trunk, as the Shadow Man appeared at its base, writhing in agony. The song shifted into a final piercing wail before falling silent. I staggered back to the RV, half expecting it to still be dead, but when I turned the key, the engine roared to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the flames still burning in the distance. The melody was gone, but the silence it left behind was almost worse. Even now, I sometimes hear faint echoes of that song in the back of my mind, and when I do, I drive faster. My name is Grayson Richmond, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in late October 2022, during what should have been a routine stop for my freelance travel blog. I was in Big Bog State Recreation Area in northern Minnesota, researching for an article about hidden gems in the Midwest. I never expected it to be the last trip I'd take by myself or the one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I arrived at Big Bog early in the afternoon, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs as I parked my rented RV in a secluded camping spot. It was off-season, and I had the area almost entirely to myself. That's how I liked it. Quiet, peaceful, the perfect place to write and gather inspiration. The bog stretched out endlessly beyond the marked trails, a sprawling wilderness of tall grasses and mirror-like water. It was beautiful in its darkness, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. The park ranger I'd spoken to earlier, Joan, had warned me about sticking to the main trails. "This bog can be unforgiving," she'd said, her tone more serious than I expected. "Stay out of the deep areas, especially at night. You don't want to end up like the others." I'd laughed it off at the time, assuming she was trying to spook me. But the way her eyes lingered on mine, the lines on her face tightening, told me there might be more to her words than I realized. After setting up camp, I decided to explore one of the marked trails near the bog. My GPS was acting up, something about weak satellite signals, but the trail was well maintained, and I didn't think I needed it. The bog smelled of damp earth and decaying vegetation, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the tall grass. About an hour in, I spotted something off the trail. It was subtle at first, just a break in the brush, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed through the thicket and stumbled upon what looked like the ruins of an old homestead. A crumbling stone foundation was all that remained of the structure, half sunken into the marshy ground. Nearby, I found something that made my skin prickle. A rusted doll, its porcelain face cracked but still smiling, and a faded black and white photograph lying half buried in the dirt. The photo showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing in front of what must have been the same cabin, though intact and whole in the picture. There was something off about their expressions, though, especially the children. They weren't smiling like you'd expect. Their faces looked solemn, almost scared. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as a trick of the atmosphere. I slipped the photo into my jacket pocket for safekeeping. It would make for a great addition to my article, a piece of history, tied to the bog's mysterious past. That night, as I sat in my RV typing notes, the first strange thing happened. The lights flickered briefly, and I heard a faint tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just tree branches rushing against the glass, but when I stepped outside to check, there was nothing there. The trees were too far from the RV for anything to have reached it. I told myself it was just my imagination and went to bed. The next morning, I woke to find my laptop had died, despite being fully charged the night before. My phone's battery had drained too, and the generator was sputtering like it was on its last legs. It wasn't a huge deal. I could make do without technology for a while, but it was inconvenient. I decided to explore further, hoping to shake off the strange unease that had settled over me. As I walked deeper into the bog, a dense fog began to roll in, muffling the world around me. The silence was absolute, almost oppressive. That's when I heard it, faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. I stopped, straining to listen, but they faded as quickly as they'd come. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish as my voice broke the stillness. Of course, there was no response. I chalked it up to the wind playing tricks on me and kept walking. About halfway through the hike, I reached a clearing where the bog opened up into a shallow pool of water. The surface was so still, it looked like glass. As I stared at it, I thought I saw movement, a ripple, then a shadow, like something just beneath the surface. My heart thudded, but when I stepped closer, there was nothing there. When I got back to the RV that evening, I realized something unsettling. The doll I'd left near the ruins was now sitting on the steps of the RV. At first, I thought maybe I'd accidentally packed it with me, but the memory of leaving it behind was vivid. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It felt heavier than it should, as if it were waterlogged. I tossed it into a storage bin, trying not to think about it. That night, I had a dream, or at least, I think it was a dream. I was standing in the ruined cabin, but it was whole again, the walls intact, and the air thick with the smell of damp wood. The children from the photo were there, playing in the corner. They turned to look at me, their faces pale and expressionless. "Stay with us," one of them said in a soft, lilting voice. The other reached out her hand, cold and wet, like she had just pulled it from the fog. I woke up gasping, my clothes soaked with sweat. The RV felt stifling, as though the air had been sucked out of it. When I glanced at the window, I froze. There was a handprint on the glass, small and smudged like a child's. By the 4th day I was ready to leave. My nerves were shot and the RV was barely functioning, but as I started packing I felt an inexplicable pull to return to the cabin ruins. It was as if something was calling me, drawing me back. Against my better judgment, I went. The bog seemed darker than before, the air heavier. When I reached the ruins, the atmosphere was suffocating. I took out the photograph and held it up, studying the faces again. That's when I heard a voice, soft, melodic, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Grayson," it whispered. "Why did you come here?" I spun around, but no one was there. The shadows seemed to shift, though, coalescing into a figure. It was the mother from the photo, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes like black pits. She stepped closer, and I realized I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, my breath shallow. "You'll stay," she said, her voice echoing in my head. "You'll stay with us." A cold, suffocating presence washed over me, and I felt myself slipping. My mind blurred, and for a moment I was back in the cabin. The walls closing in around me. The children laughed, their voices sharp and cruel, their hands grabbing at me. In a desperate burst of will, I remembered the doll. I fumbled for it in my bag, pulling it out and hurling it into the ruins. The mother screamed, a horrible guttural sound that shook the ground. The shadows recoiled and I felt the hold on me break. I ran. I didn't care about the trails or the fog. I ran until my legs burned and the RV came into sight. Throwing myself inside, I started the engine and drove, not even bothering to secure my things. The bog blurred behind me as I sped down the narrow road, not stopping until I reached a nearby gas station. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I left the photo and doll behind, but sometimes I still feel their presence, like shadows lingering at the edges of my vision. And at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I hear whispers. If you ever visit Big Bog, be careful. Some places don't want to let you go. My name is Emma Wells and I'm 30 years old. This happened last October when I joined my two closest friends for what was supposed to be a simple camping trip in Big Bend National Park. At the time, it seemed like the perfect way to escape the noise of the city. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life, one that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. It started with Jake, of course. He was too much of a thrill-seeker to his core, always itching for the next adventure. Big Bend is practically made for us, he'd said over the phone, pitching the idea like a salesman. Hiking, stargazing, legends of ghosts and skinwalkers, it's got everything. Sam, the oldest at 31, was reluctant from the beginning. As a park ranger from another state, he had a respect for the wilderness that Jake never seemed to grasp. This isn't some controlled trail in a state park, Sam warned. If we're not careful, the Chisos Basin will chew us up and spit us out. I should have listened to him. We rented an old RV, the only one available on short notice, and drove for hours to the park. As soon as we hit the basin, I felt an uneasiness settle over me. The mountains rose like jagged teeth, their shadows stretching long and deep under the late afternoon sun. The isolation was palpable. No cell service, no sounds except the wind and the occasional call of a bird. The RV was already giving us trouble. The battery light flickered as we parked at the campsite and the interior lights buzzed faintly. Jake waved it off, saying, "It'll hold. We're not driving it anywhere for a few days anyway." That night, we sat around the fire, trading stories. Jake was in his element, weaving tales about the supernatural. "Skinwalkers," he said, grinning wickedly. "Shapeshifters. They mimic voices to lure you away from safety. People go missing out here all the time, you know." Sam shook his head. "That's Navajo folklore, not from around here." "Doesn't mean it can't happen," Jake shot back. I tried to laugh it off, but as the firelight danced across the surrounding trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The first sign came in the middle of the night. I woke to a sound outside the RV, a low, guttural cry that sent chills down my spine. It sounded like an animal at first, maybe a coyote, but then it shifted, rising into a scream that almost sounded human. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, shaking Jake awake. He groaned. "It's just the wind, Emma. Go back to sleep." But it didn't feel like the wind. The next morning I found tracks near the campsite. They were large, humanoid, but wrong, too deep, too elongated, with no visible tread or pattern. Sam frowned as he studied them. "Could be a bear," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Jake, of course, was delighted. "It's the Skinwalker," he declared dramatically. "We're being hunted." "Don't joke about that," Sam snapped. We set off on a hike later that day, hoping to shake off the tension. The Chisos Mountains were breathtaking, with rugged peaks and sprawling desert views, but the further we went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. As we made our way back to the RV, I heard someone call my name. "Emma?" the voice said, soft and clear, coming from the woods to our left. I stopped in my tracks. "Jake?" I asked, turning to him. "What?" he said, walking right beside me. The voice called again. "Emma." My blood ran cold. It was my name, but it didn't sound quite right, like someone trying to imitate it and failing, just enough to be unsettling. "We need to go," Sam said, his voice low and urgent. That night, the RV felt like a prison. The battery was completely dead, leaving us with no lights except for a few weak flashlights. The fire outside barely seemed to keep the darkness at bay. Jake tried to lighten the mood, but even he seemed unnerved. The scratching started around midnight. At first, it was faint, like branches brushing against the RV, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. Something, or someone, was clawing at the door. "Stay quiet," Sam whispered, his face pale. He grabbed the fire poker and stood by the door. We held our breath as the scratching stopped. A moment later, a voice called from outside. "Sam," it said, perfectly mimicking Jake. Sam froze. "Don't answer it," he hissed. Then it called again, this time mimicking me. "Emma, let me in." Jake was the first to break. "What the hell is out there?" he demanded, moving toward the door. "Don't," Sam warned, but Jake was already reaching for the handle. Before he could open it, a shadow passed across the small window. It was humanoid, but hunched, its limbs too long, its movement jerky and unnatural. The firelight outside caught its face, and I felt bile rise in my throat. It was trying to look human, but the features were twisted, stretched, wrong. Jake stumbled back, his bravado gone. "What do we do?" he whispered. Sam gripped the fire poker tightly. "We wait. It'll leave if we don't give it what it wants." But the thing outside didn't leave. It circled the RV, tapping on the windows, its distorted voice calling out in turn for each of us. Every time it spoke, it sounded more grotesque, more inhuman. I felt the walls closing in. "We can't just sit here," I said, panic rising in my chest. Sam looked at me, his expression grim. "If we run, it'll pick us off one by one. We stay together." But the RV wasn't safe. The roof creaked under the weight of something heavy. The clawing returned, more frenzied this time. I clutched my camera, desperate for some sense of control. Without thinking, I snapped a photo of the window. The flash lit up the darkness, and for a split second, I saw it. The creature was perched just outside, its hollow eyes staring back at me. I screamed, and the thing let out a guttural shriek, retreating into the shadows. By dawn, the scratching had stopped, but the RV was in shambles. Deep claw marks scored the doors and windows. Sam made the call. We had to leave. The RV was no longer an option, so we packed what we could and set off on foot toward the nearest campsite. The fog was thick, muffling sounds and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow made my heart race. We were halfway down the trail when it struck. The creature burst from the trees, a blur of limbs and claws. It went straight for Sam, knocking him to the ground. "Run!" he yelled, swinging the fire poker wildly. "Sam!" I screamed, but Jake grabbed my arm and dragged me forward. Sam's screams echoed behind us, then fell abruptly silent. Jake and I stumbled into the next campsite hours later, bloodied and shaken. A group of hikers called for help, but by the time the rangers arrived, there was no sign of Sam or the creature. The official report listed him as missing, but I know the truth. Something ancient, something evil, took him in those mountains, and it's still out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone camping since. My name is Joseph Foreman. I'm 35 years old, and this happened in the summer of 2021, during what was supposed to be a quiet camping trip to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota. It was meant to be a simple getaway, a few days in the wild with my younger brother Ryan and my college friend Sam. I thought I'd shake off the stress of my job, reconnect with nature, and spend quality time with people I loved. Instead, it became a nightmare I can't shake. It started like most trips do, full of optimism and plans. I'd booked the permits months in advance and mapped out a route to a remote lake called Dead Man's Mirror. The name alone should have been a red flag, but I brushed it off. I'd read about the eerie folklore surrounding the place, sure, but I thought of it as nothing more than ghost stories designed to scare tourists. The reality was the lake was far enough off the beaten path that I knew it would be peaceful. That's all I wanted, peace. Ryan, 29, was skeptical from the start. "Dead Man's Mirror?" he laughed as we drove up Highway 61. "You're really leaning into the horror movie vibe here, huh?" He was sprawled across the passenger seat, lazily scrolling through his phone. "Relax," I said, my hands gripping the wheel. "It's just a name. The lake's supposed to be gorgeous." In the back seat, Sam, 31, chimed in. "Honestly, I love it. I'm ready for some creepy vibes. Bring on the ghosts!" She sounded cheerful, then eager. I wish I could have bottled that enthusiasm before things went sideways. The first 2 days were uneventful enough. We paddled through glassy lakes, the only sounds the dip of our oars and the occasional call of a loon. The weather was perfect. Blue skies, cool breezes. Even the portages, which I usually dreaded, felt manageable. But the wilderness has a way of shifting its mood. It started on the second night. We'd set up camp at a clearing near Dead Man's Mirror, a lake that lived up to its name with its unnaturally smooth surface. Not a single ripple broke its mirror-like stillness, even though the breeze stirred the surrounding pines. Sam joked that it looked like a portal to another world. That night, after we'd finished a dinner of freeze-dried chili and marshmallows, we sat around the fire sharing ghost stories. Sam told us about the Wendigo, a creature from Ojibwe folklore that preyed on those lost in the wilderness, driving them mad before devouring them. As she spoke, the wind picked up, rustling the trees in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It felt deliberate. "Okay, enough of that," Ryan said, tossing another log onto the fire. "We're scaring ourselves over nothing." But later that night, as I lay in my old tent, I heard footsteps. They were light, almost cautious, circling the camp. My first thought was deer, but these footsteps didn't have the uneven rhythm of an animal. They were deliberate, human. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear more. The fire outside had died down, leaving the camp bathed in darkness. I wanted to call out to Ryan or Sam, but something stopped me, an instinct I couldn't explain. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. The next day, I didn't mention the footsteps. Maybe I was being paranoid, I told myself. Maybe it was just the forest playing tricks on me. But the forest felt different. The air was heavier, the light dimmer, even though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. As we portaged our canoe to another section of the lake, Sam suddenly stumbled, falling hard onto her knees. "Are you okay?" I rushed to help her up. Her face was pale. "I'm fine, She stopped, staring into the trees. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Ryan asked, brushing pine needles off her jacket. She hesitated. "I thought I saw someone over there." She pointed to the dense forest where the shadows were too thick to make out anything. Ryan rolled his eyes. "It's just the trees, Sam. Relax." But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. That evening, things escalated. We were sitting around the fire again, trying to keep things light, when I noticed a fox at the edge of the clearing. At first, it seemed normal enough, just standing there, its orange fur glowing faintly in the firelight. But as I watched, I realized it wasn't moving. It was staring at us, unblinking, for far too long. Ryan tried to scare it off, shouting and waving his arms. The fox didn't flinch. It just turned and disappeared into the woods. "That was weird," Sam said, hugging her knees to her chest. I nodded, my stomach churning. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more deliberate. I could hear them circling not just my tent, but the entire camp. And then a voice. Joseph. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. My blood turned to ice. "Joseph, come here." I bolted upright, my hands trembling as I unzipped the tent. The camp was empty except for the dying embers of the fire. I scanned the clearing, my flashlight trembling in my hand, but nothing moved. The forest was silent again, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The next morning I told Ryan and Sam what I'd heard. "That's it," Sam said, her voice shaking. "I want to leave today." "Seriously?" Ryan scoffed. "It's just the wilderness messing with your head. We're fine." "We're not fine," Sam snapped. "Something's out there, Ryan. Something's watching us." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down I knew she was right. By the time we packed up camp and started paddling back, the wilderness seemed to conspire against us. A thick fog rolled in, so dense we could barely see the shoreline. The compass I'd brought spun uselessly, its needle twitching erratically. "We're going in circles," I said, my voice tight with panic. "No, we're not," Ryan argued, but he didn't sound convinced. The shoreline shifted as though the lake was alive, rearranging itself to trap us. Every time we thought we were making progress, we'd end up back at the same spot. That's when we heard the laughter. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Children's laughter echoing across the water. "There's no one out here," Sam whispered, her face pale. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. and then the whispers began. By nightfall, we'd given up trying to escape. Exhausted and terrified, we set up camp at the same clearing we'd started from. The forest came alive around us. Shadows moved at the edges of the firelight, shapes too large and too fluid to be animals. A low growl echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, and then we saw it. At first it looked like a man, tall and gaunt, standing just beyond the firelight, but as it stepped closer, its shape shifted. Its limbs grew longer, its face stretching into something inhuman. Its eyes were hollow, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Sam screamed, and Ryan grabbed the hatchet we'd brought for firewood, brandishing it uselessly. The creature didn't attack. It just stood there, watching us, tilting its head like a curious animal. I remembered the legend Sam had told by the fire, the Wendigo, a creature that preyed on fear, feeding on the weak and desperate. I had to do something. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed my camera, the one thing I'd brought to document the trip, and hurled it into the lake. The creature paused, its glowing eyes following the splash for a moment. The forest was silent. Then it retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't sleep that night. At the first light of dawn, we paddled furiously, not stopping until we reached the ranger station. The ranger listened to our story without a hint of surprise. When we finished, he nodded grimly. "You're lucky it let you go," he said. "It's been over a year since that trip, and I still hear the whispers sometimes. Late at night when I'm alone, I feel its eyes on me. I know it's waiting." My name is Penelope Jacobs, and I was 29 when this happened in late October 2022. I've always considered myself a rational person. As a freelance journalist, I've spent years chasing stories about ghosts, cryptids, and haunted places. Most of the time, these stories amount to nothing but overactive imaginations or cleverly planted hoaxes. That's what I thought would happen when I decided to investigate Devil's Hollow. I'd first heard about the place from a Reddit thread on urban legends in Wisconsin and Minnesota. The name popped up several times, an abandoned section of Black River State Forest, where hikers reported strange symbols carved into trees, unnatural noises, and even sightings of a horned figure. Locals said it was cursed, that rituals had been performed there long ago to summon something dark. I wanted to write a feature on modern-day folklore, and Devil's Hollow seemed like the perfect subject. It wasn't far from where I was staying, and I had my RV, so I could camp overnight to immerse myself in the story. What I didn't realize was that I wouldn't leave that hollow the same person I was when I arrived. I parked my RV at the end of a dirt trail that was barely visible through the thick trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint whisper of the wind and the creak of the trees. I grabbed my gear, a flashlight, camera, and notebook, and set off toward the hollow. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the ground soft and damp beneath my boots. As I walked, I noticed the trees seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches reaching toward each other like skeletal fingers. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, as though the forest itself was pressing down on me. After about an hour, I found it. A small clearing with a moss-covered stone altar at its center. The altar looked ancient, its surface blackened by scorch marks. Around it, the ground was barren, as though nothing dared to grow there. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, spirals, triangles, and shapes that looked almost like runes. I snapped a few photos, making careful notes about the markings. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else. Chanting, faint and low, carried on the breeze. It seemed to come from deeper in the forest, though I couldn't see anyone. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe the sound of distant hikers. I spent a couple of hours exploring the area, documenting claw-like marks on nearby trees and scorch patterns on the rocks. Just as the sun started to dip below the horizon, I stumbled across something buried near the altar. A weathered, leather-bound diary. Its cover was damp, the pages stained and yellowed with age, but the words inside were still legible. The entries were written by a man named John, who had camped in Devil's Hollow decades ago. At first he described it as a place of eerie beauty, but as the days went on, his tone grew frantic. He wrote about hearing whispers at night, seeing shadowy figures in the trees, and feeling an oppressive presence watching him. One of the last entries read, "The spiral marks the place of power. I can't escape it. It watches from the trees. I hear it breathing." I felt a chill crawl down my spine, the spiral. I looked back at the altar, at the markings carved into the stone, and wondered if John had seen the same thing. The chanting was louder now, closer, and it was enough to send me hurrying back to the RV. That night I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and tried to focus on transcribing my notes. But then the lights flickered, even though the generator was running fine. A faint hum filled the air, and my radio crackled to life, playing snippets of distorted voices. I turned it off, but the noise didn't stop. Outside, the motion detector light flickered on. My stomach clenched as I peeked out the window. The clearing was empty, or so it seemed. Just as I turned away, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall and thin, its shape almost human, but its arms were too long, and its head had the distinct curve of horns. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I didn't want to go outside, but something inside me, a mix of fear and defiance, made me step out. The figure was gone, but when I shone the flashlight on a nearby tree, I saw a fresh carving, a spiral, dripping with a black tar-like substance. I stumbled back into the RV, locking the door behind me. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed up clutching my knife, jumping at every creak and groan of the RV. The next morning, I knew I had to leave, but before I could pack up, I felt an inexplicable pull to go back to the altar. It was as though something was compelling me, drawing me in against my better judgment. I grabbed the diary and my camera and headed back into the forest. When I reached the altar, the air was even colder than before. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the chanting had returned, louder than ever. The spiral markings on the altar seemed to pulse, glowing faintly in the dim light. Then I felt it, a presence, heavy and suffocating. I turned, and there it was, the horned figure, standing just beyond the clearing. Its body was skeletal, its skin stretched taut over its frame, the horns curved like a ram's, and its hollow eyes glowed with a faint, sickly light. It didn't move, but I felt its malice like a physical weight. It spoke, but not aloud. The words echoed in my mind, low and guttural. "You have trespassed. This place is mine. You will offer something of value, or you will not leave." I was paralyzed, my legs refusing to move. The diary slipped from my hands and landed on the altar. The horned figure tilted its head as though amused. I don't know what gave me the idea. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe something in the diary had planted the seed, but I grabbed my lighter and set the pages on fire. The flames consumed the book quickly, and as they did, the chanting stopped. The figure let out a deafening roar, its form flickering like smoke. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran back to the RV, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, the RV shook violently, as though something was trying to force its way inside. The lights flickered, and the radio crackled with static, but I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away, in the safety of a brightly lit gas station parking lot. It's been weeks since I left Devil's Hollow, but the memories still haunt me. The photos I took of the altar and the spiral symbols made their way into my article, sparking debates and wild theories online. But I didn't include everything. I didn't write about the horned figure or the whispers, or how I can still feel its presence even now. Sometimes late at night I wake up to find the spiral symbols scratched into my walls, and I know it's not over. The hollow never lets you go.